35 chilling moments in history to fall asleep to. The Tunguska Event in Siberia. June 30th, 1908. In the remote wilderness of Siberia, near the Podkamenia Tunguska River, the morning began like any other. The sun rose over endless stretches of taiga, the air still and heavy. Then, without warning, the sky erupted. A blinding flash lit the horizon, followed by a shockwave so powerful it flattened over 80 million trees across more than 800 square miles. The blast was heard hundreds of miles away. People were thrown to the ground, windows shattered, and the earth itself seemed to convulse. Yet, in the center of this devastation, there was no crater, no impact site, no obvious source for the destruction, just a scorched, empty expanse where the forest had been. From a psychological perspective, the absence of a clear cause is what transformed the Tunguska Event from a natural disaster into one of history's most enduring mysteries. Humans are wired to seek patterns, to match cause with effect. When the effect is this massive, the mind demands an equally massive cause. But when that cause is invisible or missing entirely, it creates a vacuum that the imagination rushes to fill. The first challenge was geography. The blast site was so remote that no scientific expedition reached it for nearly 2 decades. In that time, the story spread through local accounts. A fireball racing across the sky, a pillar of light brighter than the sun, a deafening roar. Some described the ground shaking as if the world itself were breaking apart. Others spoke of a strange, metallic taste in the air, of animals fleeing before the explosion. When scientists finally arrived in 1927, they found the trees radiating outward from a central point, all lying in the same direction, as if pushed down by an invisible hand. But there was no sign of a meteorite, no fragments of rock or metal. The mystery deepened. The most widely accepted theory is that a comet or asteroid exploded in the atmosphere before hitting the ground, a phenomenon known as an airburst. The heat and pressure from the explosion would have been enough to flatten the forest without leaving a crater. But even this explanation leaves gaps. Why were no definitive fragments ever found? Why did some witnesses report glowing skies for days afterward, as if the atmosphere itself had been altered? Here is where the intrigue begins. Over the years, alternative theories have emerged, some scientific, others speculative. A volcanic gas eruption, a miniature black hole passing through the Earth, even the crash of an alien spacecraft. Each theory reflects a different psychological need, the desire for a rational, measurable cause, or the allure of the extraordinary. The cover-up narrative took shape during the Soviet era. Some researchers claimed that early expeditions found more than they reported. Unusual metallic debris, traces of radiation, but that these findings were suppressed. In a time when information was tightly controlled, the idea that the full truth was hidden fit neatly into the public's growing distrust of official narratives. Whether or not such evidence existed, the secrecy surrounding Soviet scientific work only fueled suspicion. From a psychological lens, this is the power of omission. When authorities withhold information, whether intentionally or simply through bureaucratic delay, it creates space for conspiracy. The human mind often prefers a hidden truth to an incomplete one. The Tunguska Event also reveals how trauma shapes memory. Many of the eyewitnesses were indigenous Evenki people, whose oral traditions preserved the event in vivid, symbolic language. They spoke of the god Ogdi striking down the forest, of a fiery dragon falling from the sky. These accounts, while not scientific, capture the raw sensory and emotional impact of the blast. They also show how the mind encodes the incomprehensible into familiar cultural frameworks. The mystery is compounded by the event's scale. The energy released is estimated to have been equivalent to 10 to 15 megatons of TNT, hundreds of times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And yet, because it happened in such an isolated region, there were no confirmed human casualties. This paradox, immense destruction with minimal loss of life, adds to the surreal quality of the story. In the decades since, expeditions have returned to Tunguska with modern equipment. Soil samples, tree ring studies, and satellite imagery have all been used to piece together the puzzle. Some evidence supports the airburst theory, but other findings, such as unusual isotopes in the soil, keep the door open for alternative explanations. The lack of definitive proof ensures that the mystery remains alive. From a psychological standpoint, the Tunguska event endures because it sits at the intersection of fear and wonder. It is a reminder that the universe can unleash unimaginable power without warning, and that our understanding of such events is still incomplete. It also taps into a deeper human fascination, the idea that there are forces, natural or otherwise, that operate beyond our control and perhaps beyond our comprehension. The cover-up theories, whether grounded in fact or not, speak to a universal suspicion that those in power may know more than they admit. In the case of Tunguska, the remoteness of the site, the delay in investigation, and the political climate of the time all combined to create fertile ground for such beliefs. And so, more than a century later, the Tunguska event remains a riddle. Was it a comet disintegrating in the atmosphere? An asteroid grazing the Earth? A rare and poorly understood natural phenomenon? Or something stranger still, hidden in the folds of history? The intrigue lies not just in what happened, but in how we respond to it. Faced with an event that defies easy explanation, we construct narratives, scientific, mythical, conspiratorial, to fill the void. Each narrative tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the event. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Tunguska. It is not only a story about a blast in the Siberian wilderness, but about the human mind's relentless drive to explain, to connect, to uncover. And in that drive, we reveal our deepest fears, our boldest imaginations, and our enduring suspicion that the world still holds secrets too vast to be contained. The forest has grown back now, but the pattern of flattened trees remains etched in old photographs, a silent testament to the morning when the sky exploded. And somewhere in that silence, the mystery waits, unchallenged, unresolved, and as compelling as ever. The Halifax Explosion. December 6, 1917. A cold, clear morning in Halifax, Nova Scotia. The harbor was alive with movement. Ships loading cargo, workers bustling along the docks, the city waking to another day in the middle of a world at war. But in the Narrows, the narrow channel connecting the harbor to the open sea, two ships were on a collision course. One was the Norwegian vessel Imo, carrying relief supplies. The other, the French ship Mont Blanc, was loaded with a deadly cargo, explosives, benzol, and picric acid, enough to level a city. The collision itself was minor, a scrape of steel against steel, but sparks met vapors, and fire erupted on the Mont Blanc's deck. The crew, knowing the danger, abandoned ship and rowed frantically to shore, shouting warnings in French that few understood. The burning vessel drifted toward the city's waterfront, drawing curious onlookers. People gathered at windows, on streets, and along the docks, watching the strange, smoking ship. From a psychological perspective, this was the fatal moment. Humans are drawn to spectacle, even when danger is present. The mind struggles to grasp the scale of an unfamiliar threat. A burning ship was unusual, but it didn't trigger the instinct to flee, especially in a city accustomed to the sights and sounds of a busy wartime harbor. Curiosity overpowered caution. At 9:04 a.m., the Mont Blanc exploded. The blast was so powerful it vaporized the ship, flattened buildings for miles, and sent a shockwave that shattered windows 50 miles away. A column of smoke rose into the sky, and a tsunami surged into the harbor. Nearly 2,000 people were killed instantly or in the hours that followed. Thousands more were injured, many blinded by flying glass. It was the largest man-made explosion in history until the atomic bomb. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Streets were unrecognizable, littered with debris and bodies. Fires raged. The wounded cried out from the ruins. And then, as if the city had not suffered enough, a blizzard swept in the next day, burying the devastation under snow. The mystery begins in the questions that followed. How could such a disaster happen in a controlled harbor? Why was a ship carrying such volatile cargo allowed so close to a populated area? And why were warnings so ineffective? The official inquiry placed blame on both captains, citing navigational errors and miscommunication. But many in Halifax suspected there was more to the story. The Mont Blanc's cargo was a wartime secret, its manifest concealed to avoid drawing attention from enemy spies or saboteurs. This secrecy meant that even harbor officials and local authorities were unaware of the danger until it was too late. In effect, the very effort to protect the shipment may have doomed the city. From a psychological standpoint, this is the paradox of secrecy. Information withheld for security can create vulnerabilities elsewhere. The crew of the Mont Blanc knew the risk, but their inability to communicate it, both because of language barriers and because of orders to keep the cargo confidential, meant the people of Halifax had no chance to react appropriately. The cover-up theories emerged quickly. Some believe the inquiry was designed to protect higher authorities from blame, focusing instead on the actions of the ship captains. Others pointed to the wartime context, admitting that military supply protocols had endangered a civilian population could have been politically disastrous. The narrative that emerged was one of tragic accident, not systemic failure. The psychology of blame also played a role. In the wake of catastrophe, people seek a clear cause, a single point of failure. It's easier to process than the unsettling truth that disasters often result from a chain of small errors, each insignificant on its own but devastating in combination. By focusing on individual culpability, the inquiry gave the public a target for their anger, while the deeper systemic issues faded from view. There is also the haunting question of how the human mind processes sudden, large-scale trauma. Survivors spoke of being unable to comprehend what had happened, of wandering through ruins in a daze, unable to recognize familiar streets. Psychologists now understand this as a form of shock, the brain's way of protecting itself from overwhelming sensory and emotional input. But in 1917, it was simply described as being stunned. The intrigue deepens when you consider the long-term effects. The explosion reshaped Halifax physically and psychologically. Entire neighborhoods were rebuilt, but the memory of that morning lingered in the collective consciousness. For decades, survivors spoke of strange details, the way the sky seemed to flash white, the eerie silence before the sound reached them, the feeling that time itself had paused. These fragments became part of the city's identity, passed down through generations. And yet, the official story remained largely unchanged, a tragic accident, the result of navigational error. The possibility that wartime secrecy, inadequate harbor protocols, and systemic negligence had played a decisive role was rarely addressed in public forums. Whether this was deliberate suppression or simply the inertia of an accepted narrative is still debated. From a psychological lens, the Halifax explosion is a study in how humans respond to the unimaginable. Before the blast, curiosity drew people toward danger. In the moment, shock froze them in place. Afterward, the need for answers, and for someone to blame, shaped the story that would be told. And in the shadows, the possibility of a deeper truth remained, obscured by the fog of war and the politics of the time. The mystery of Halifax is not whether the explosion happened, it is how much of its cause was hidden and whether the full truth was ever meant to be known. The cover-up, if it existed, was not about denying the event, but about controlling its meaning. In that sense, the explosion was not just a physical disaster, but a psychological one, an event where perception, secrecy, and tragedy collided. More than a century later, the blast still echoes, not just in the history books, but in the way it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. That safety can be an illusion, that secrecy can be as dangerous as exposure, and that the stories we are told about disaster are often as carefully constructed as the defenses meant to prevent them. The Halifax explosion remains a testament to the fragility of human systems, and to the enduring power of mystery, cover-up, and the human mind's struggle to make sense of the unthinkable. The Roswell Incident. July 1947. A rancher named W. Mack Brazel discovers strange debris scattered across his land near Roswell, New Mexico. Not the kind of wreckage you'd expect from a weather balloon or an aircraft. This was something different. Metallic strips that returned to their shape after being crumpled, beams with strange symbols, fragments that seemed impossibly light, yet unbreakable. Brazel reports it to the local authorities, and soon the military is involved. At first, the U.S. Army issues a statement that electrifies the nation. They have recovered a flying disc. Newspapers print the headline in bold. For a brief moment, the impossible seems to have happened. Proof that something from beyond our world has arrived. But within 24 hours, the story changes. The military retracts its statement, claiming the debris was from a weather balloon. The original press release is dismissed as a misunderstanding. From a psychological perspective, this reversal is fascinating. Human beings are wired to latch onto extraordinary explanations when confronted with extraordinary evidence. The initial announcement triggered a wave of wonder and fear, emotions that are hard to erase. When the official narrative shifted, it didn't erase the first impression, it created cognitive dissonance. People were left with two conflicting realities, the one they were told and the one they felt was true. The cover-up theory took root immediately. Why would the military make such a sensational claim, only to retract it so quickly? Was it a simple mistake or a deliberate attempt to control the narrative? In times of uncertainty, secrecy breeds suspicion. The more the government insisted it was nothing unusual, the more people believed it was something extraordinary. The mystery deepened in the decades that followed. Witnesses came forward with stories of strange materials, of military trucks moving under the cover of night, of threats to keep silent. Some claimed to have seen bodies, small, humanoid, unlike anything human. Whether these accounts were genuine memories, misinterpretations, or the result of suggestion, they added layers to the legend. Psychologically, this is the power of suggestion and collective memory. Once an idea takes hold, especially one as dramatic as alien contact, it shapes how people interpret events. Details are remembered, forgotten, or altered to fit the narrative. Over time, the story becomes less about what actually happened and more about what it has come to represent, the possibility that we are not alone and that those in power might be hiding the truth. The intrigue is amplified by the Cold War context. In 1947, the United States was entering an era of heightened secrecy. The military was developing advanced aircraft and surveillance technology. If the Roswell debris was part of a classified project, admitting it could have compromised national security. In that light, the weather balloon explanation could have been a convenient cover, not to hide aliens, but to hide human technology. Yet the choice to use such a mundane explanation may have backfired, making the story seem even more suspicious. From a psychological lens, the Roswell incident also reveals how humans respond to the unknown. Faced with incomplete information, we fill in the gaps with the most compelling story we can imagine. For some, that story is extraterrestrial contact. For others, it's a tale of government deception. In both cases, the truth becomes secondary to the narrative that feels most satisfying. The cover-up narrative gained new life in the late 1970s, when researchers began interviewing surviving witnesses. Their testimonies, often decades after the fact, spoke of strange wreckage, military intimidation, and secret transports. Critics pointed out the fallibility of memory, especially over long periods. Supporters argued that the consistency of certain details pointed to something real. The debate became less about evidence and more about belief. And that's where the psychology becomes most intriguing. Belief systems are resilient. Once someone commits to a version of events, whether it's the official explanation or the alien theory, contradictory evidence often strengthens their conviction rather than weakening it. This is known as the backfire effect. In the case of Roswell, every new denial from the government only fueled the conviction of those who believed in a cover-up. The mystery is further complicated by the release of official reports in the 1990s, which claimed the debris was from a top-secret balloon project designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests. This explanation fits the Cold War context, but it arrived decades too late to erase the alien narrative. By then, Roswell had become a cultural phenomenon. Books, documentaries, and films had cemented it in the public imagination. The truth, whatever it was, had been overtaken by the legend. From a psychological standpoint, this is the final twist. Sometimes the cover-up is not about hiding the truth, but about losing control of it. Once a story escapes into the public consciousness, it takes on a life of its own. The Roswell incident stopped being a single event and became a symbol of secrecy, of distrust, of the tantalizing possibility that we are part of a larger cosmic story. The intrigue endures because the questions remain unanswered. Was it a weather balloon, a secret military project, or something not of this earth? The official explanations have never fully satisfied the human hunger for mystery. And perhaps that's the real reason Roswell still matters. Not because of what happened, but because of what it represents, the tension between what we are told and what we believe, between the known and the unknown. In the end, the Roswell Incident is less about debris in a desert and more about the human mind. It's about how we process uncertainty, how we respond to secrecy, and how we construct meaning from fragments. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful force in shaping history is not the event itself, but the story we tell about it, and the shadows where truth and imagination meet. The Cold War nuclear close calls. For nearly half a century, the world lived under the shadow of annihilation. Two superpowers, armed with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the planet many times over, stared each other down across oceans and ideology. The Cold War was not just a political standoff. It was a psychological pressure cooker where a single miscalculation, a single misunderstood signal, could have ended civilization. And on more than one occasion, it almost did. What makes these moments so haunting is that they were not always the result of deliberate aggression. Often, they were born from human error, technical glitches, or the fog of uncertainty. The psychology of these close calls is chilling. When the stakes are total destruction, the margin for error is almost non-existent. One of the most infamous incidents came in 1983, deep inside a Soviet early warning bunker. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was on duty when alarms blared. Satellite systems reported that several U.S. nuclear missiles had been launched toward the Soviet Union. Protocol dictated an immediate report to superiors, triggering a retaliatory strike. But Petrov hesitated. Something about the alert didn't feel right. The number of missiles was too small for a first strike, and the radar data was unconfirmed. Trusting his instincts over the system, he declared it a false alarm. He was right. The attack was sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds. His decision may have saved hundreds of millions of lives. From a psychological standpoint, Petrov's choice was extraordinary. In high-pressure environments, humans are prone to automation bias, the tendency to trust machines over intuition. Petrov resisted that pull, relying on judgment rather than blind obedience. But his heroism was buried for years, unacknowledged by the Soviet state, because admitting how close they had come to disaster would have exposed the fragility of their defenses. Another brush with catastrophe came 2 decades earlier, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. While the world watched the tense standoff between Kennedy and Khrushchev, a Soviet submarine near Cuba was being hunted by U.S. Navy ships. Depth charges, intended as warning shots, exploded around it. The submarine's captain, believing war had already begun, prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. Only the intervention of his second-in-command, Vasily Arkhipov, prevented it. Arkhipov argued for surfacing instead of firing, a decision that may have averted World War III. The mystery here lies in how close we came without knowing it. The public narrative of the Cuban Missile Crisis focused on diplomacy and backchannel deals. The submarine incident was hidden for decades, a secret too dangerous to reveal. This is the psychology of the cover-up. Leaders fear that exposing the full truth will undermine public confidence, or worse, reveal vulnerabilities to adversaries. Not all close calls were the result of human restraint. In 1979, a training tape simulating a massive Soviet attack was accidentally loaded into NORAD's live warning system. Screens lit up with hundreds of incoming missiles. For several minutes, U.S. forces prepared for a retaliatory strike. Only after cross-checking with radar did they realize it was a false alarm. The incident was quietly downplayed, the details obscured. Admitting that a simple human error could have triggered nuclear war was unthinkable. The psychology of these moments is shaped by what's known as threat amplification. In a high-alert environment, ambiguous signals are more likely to be interpreted as hostile. During the Cold War, both sides lived in a constant state of readiness, primed to see danger in every shadow. This mindset kept them vigilant, but it also made them vulnerable to overreaction. Perhaps the most unsettling close call came in 1995, after the Cold War had officially ended. A Norwegian scientific team launched a rocket to study the Northern Lights. Its trajectory resembled that of a U.S. submarine-launched missile. Russian radar operators sounded the alarm, and for the first time in history, the Russian nuclear briefcase was activated for the president. For several tense minutes, the possibility of a retaliatory strike was real. Only when the rocket fell harmlessly into the sea was the alert canceled. The scientists had notified multiple governments of the launch, but the message never reached the right Russian channels. The intrigue in these stories lies not just in the events themselves, but in how they were handled afterward. Many were classified for decades, their details emerging only through declassified documents or personal accounts. The cover-ups were not always malicious. Sometimes they were acts of self-preservation, shielding leaders from political fallout or preventing public panic. But they also served to hide just how fragile the balance of peace truly was. From a psychological lens, these close calls reveal the paradox of deterrence. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction was meant to prevent war by making its cost unthinkable, but it also created a system where the decision to launch could be made in minutes, based on incomplete or faulty information. The very speed designed to ensure survival also increased the risk of catastrophe. What's most haunting is how much depended on individual judgment. Petrov, Arkhipov, and others like them were not following orders when they prevented disaster. They were breaking from them. In rigid military hierarchies, such defiance is rare. It requires not just courage, but the ability to think beyond the immediate pressure, to imagine the consequences of being wrong in either direction. The Cold War's nuclear close calls are reminders that history often turns on moments invisible to the public. They show how secrecy can protect stability, but also obscure the lessons we should learn. They reveal the fragility of systems we assume are infallible and the human flaws, both dangerous and life-saving, that run through them. And perhaps the greatest mystery is how many other close calls remain unknown. How many times did a radar blip, a garbled transmission, or a misunderstood maneuver bring us to the brink without ever making it into the history books? The Cold War may be over, but the weapons remain, and so does the possibility that the next close call will not end with restraint. In the end, these stories are not just about the past, they are warnings. They remind us that the line between peace and destruction is often drawn not by grand strategy, but by the split-second decisions of individuals under unimaginable pressure, and that the most dangerous moments in history are often the ones we never knew were happening at all. The Cuban Missile Crisis. October 1962. The world stood closer to nuclear war than it ever had before or since. For 13 days, the fate of millions hung on a knife's edge, balanced between diplomacy and annihilation. On the surface, it was a geopolitical standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union over missiles in Cuba. Beneath the surface, it was a psychological chess match, a web of secrecy, misdirection, and decisions made in rooms where the public would never be allowed. It began with photographs, grainy, black-and-white images taken by American U-2 reconnaissance planes. They revealed something that, until then, had been only a suspicion: Soviet nuclear missiles being installed on Cuban soil, just 90 miles from the U.S. coastline. The discovery was a shock, but also a test. How do you respond to a threat that is both undeniable and politically explosive? From a psychological perspective, the first move was critical. President John F. Kennedy and his advisors faced a dilemma: act too aggressively and risk triggering the very war they sought to avoid, act too cautiously and appear weak, inviting further provocation. The human mind under such pressure narrows its focus, weighing risks in terms of survival rather than ideology. Every decision was filtered through the lens of what happens if we're wrong. The public, at first, knew nothing. The administration kept the discovery secret while options were debated. This secrecy was not just strategic, it was psychological containment. Leaders feared that if the truth leaked too soon, panic could spread, markets could collapse, and political pressure could force rash action. In moments like this, information becomes a weapon, and controlling it is as important as controlling armies. When Kennedy finally addressed the nation, the words were measured but chilling. He announced a quarantine of Cuba, a naval blockade to prevent further delivery of missiles. The choice of the word quarantine instead of blockade was deliberate. In international law, a blockade is an act of war. A quarantine sounded defensive, almost medical. This was psychological framing at its most precise. Project strength without triggering the legal or emotional tripwires that could escalate the crisis. Behind the scenes, the mystery deepened. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev sent 2 letters to Kennedy during the standoff. The first was almost conciliatory, suggesting a deal: remove U.S. missiles from Turkey in exchange for removing Soviet missiles from Cuba. The second, arriving the next day, was harsher, more demanding, and more public. Why the shift? Was it internal division within the Soviet leadership, or a calculated tactic to confuse and pressure the Americans? The truth remains debated, but the effect was clear. It forced Kennedy to choose which message to respond to, shaping the narrative of the negotiations. The cover-up element emerges in what the public was told after the crisis ended. Officially, the resolution was simple. The Soviets agreed to withdraw their missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. pledged not to invade the island. What was not revealed at the time was the secret agreement to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey, a concession that balanced the deal but was kept hidden to preserve the image of an unqualified U.S. victory. This secrecy was not just about politics. It was about maintaining psychological dominance in the Cold War. Admitting to a trade would have signaled vulnerability. The psychology of brinkmanship was on full display. Both sides had to project absolute resolve while privately searching for a way out. This required a delicate balance between public posturing and private flexibility. Too much concession in public could embolden the other side. Too much rigidity in private could make compromise impossible. Leaders on both sides were playing to multiple audiences: their own governments, their allies, their adversaries, and the watching world. And then there were the near misses, the moments when the crisis could have spiraled out of control through misunderstanding or accident. A US U-2 plane was shot down over Cuba during the standoff, killing the pilot. Many in the U.S. military saw this as an act of war, urging immediate retaliation. Kennedy resisted, understanding that one misstep could unleash a chain reaction. In another incident, a U.S. Navy destroyer dropped practice depth charges near a Soviet submarine, unaware it carried nuclear torpedoes. The submarine's captain considered launching, but was persuaded otherwise by his second-in-command. These moments were not part of the official narrative at the time. They were buried because they revealed just how close the world had come to catastrophe. From a psychological standpoint, the crisis was a masterclass in controlled fear. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev understood that fear could be a tool, but only if it was managed. Too much, and it would lead to panic and irrational action. Too little, and it would fail to compel the other side to negotiate. The art was in keeping the tension high enough to force movement, but low enough to avoid detonation. The intrigue lingers because so much of what happened was hidden from the public for years. The backchannel communications, the secret missile trade, the near disasters, all of these were omitted from the official story. The cover-up was not about lying outright, but about omission, crafting a version of events that served the strategic needs of the moment. In the end, the Cuban Missile Crisis ended without war. The missiles were removed, the blockade lifted, and the world exhaled. But the psychological scars remained. Leaders had stared into the abyss and seen how easily human error, pride, or miscommunication could end civilization. The mystery lies in how much of the resolution was luck, how much was skill, and how much was the result of decisions made in shadows, away from the cameras and the speeches. The Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as a triumph of diplomacy, but it is also a reminder of how fragile peace can be. It shows how secrecy can be both a shield and a weapon, how perception can be as decisive as firepower, and how the most dangerous battles are often fought in the minds of those making the choices. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth. For 13 days in 1962, the survival of the world depended not on armies or missiles, but on the psychology of a handful of men who had to decide, in real time, whether to step back from the edge or take the final step into the abyss. The fall of the Roman Empire. It is one of history's most enduring enigmas. How a civilization that once ruled from the windswept moors of Britain to the deserts of Egypt, that built roads still standing today, that commanded armies feared across continents, could collapse into ruin. The story is not just about battles lost or borders breached. It is about the psychology of power, the slow corrosion of stability, and the shadows where truth and cover-up intertwine. Rome, at its height, was more than a state, it was an idea. The empire projected an image of eternal strength, of order ordained by the gods. But beneath the marble and the legions, cracks were forming. The psychology of empire is seductive. When dominance feels permanent, leaders and citizens alike begin to believe it is. That belief breeds complacency. And complacency is the first step toward decline. The mystery of Rome's fall lies in its complexity. There was no single day when the empire simply ceased to exist. Instead, it was a slow unraveling, a series of blows, economic, political, military, that compounded over centuries. Yet even as the foundations weakened, Rome's leaders clung to the illusion of control. Official proclamations spoke of victory while provinces slipped away. Grain shortages were explained away as temporary. The truth was managed, reshaped, and sometimes buried entirely. From a psychological standpoint, this is the danger of denial at scale. Leaders feared that acknowledging the depth of the crisis would invite panic, rebellion, or opportunistic attacks. So they masked the symptoms, hoping to buy time. But in doing so, they allowed the disease to spread. The empire's enemies were not always at the gates. They were often within. Corruption seeped into the Senate. Military loyalty shifted from the state to individual generals, and the once disciplined legions became fractured. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect the emperor, became kingmakers and executioners, selling the throne to the highest bidder. This erosion of trust in institutions is a psychological breaking point. When people no longer believe in the system begins to collapse from within. And yet, the official narrative rarely admitted this. Chroniclers under imperial patronage painted Rome's troubles as the fault of outsiders, barbarian invasions, treacherous allies, foreign plots. While these threats were real, they were also convenient scapegoats. Blaming the other unified the populace, at least temporarily, and distracted from the rot at the core. This is the timeless tactic of the cover-up. Redirect attention outward to avoid scrutiny inward. The mystery deepens when we consider the role of overexpansion. Rome's borders stretched so far that defending them drained the treasury and exhausted the army. But retreat was politically unthinkable. To abandon territory was to admit weakness, and weakness was an idea Rome could not allow. So the empire bled itself dry, maintaining the image of dominance long after the reality had faded. Psychologically, this is the sunk cost fallacy on a civilizational scale, the refusal to cut losses because of the resources already invested. Every new campaign, every fortified frontier, was an attempt to justify the sacrifices already made. But each one pushed Rome closer to the brink. The final centuries were marked by a strange duality, grandeur and decay existing side by side. In the cities, games and spectacles continued, a distraction for the masses. Bread was distributed to keep the poor from rioting. The Colosseum roared even as the aqueducts crumbled. This was not ignorance, it was deliberate. Leaders understood the power of spectacle to pacify, to keep the public focused on the stage while the scaffolding behind it collapsed. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, it was a shock to the world. The Eternal City had been breached. Yet even then, the empire staggered on for decades, its eastern half thriving while the west withered. The final blow came in 476 AD, when the last emperor of the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. But even this moment was shrouded in ambiguity. There was no grand battle, no dramatic last stand, just a quiet transfer of power, as if the empire had already died in spirit long before its body fell. The cover-up here is subtle but profound. Later histories often frame the fall as inevitable, the result of fate or divine will. This narrative absolves individuals of responsibility, turning a preventable decline into a cosmic certainty. But the truth is more uncomfortable. Rome's fall was the product of human choices, short-sighted policies, political infighting, and the refusal to confront hard truths. From a psychological lens, the empire's collapse is a study in collective denial. People adapt to decline in stages. First, they ignore it. Then, they normalize it. Finally, they accept it as the new reality. By the time the barbarians were at the gates, many Romans had already adjusted to a smaller, weaker world. The empire's death was not a sudden trauma. It was a long, numbing fade. And yet, the mystery endures because Rome never truly vanished. Its laws, its architecture, its language, its very idea of governance lived on in the states that followed. This blurs the line between fall and transformation. Was the empire destroyed, or did it simply change shape, its essence hidden in plain sight? The intrigue lies in how the story has been told. Each generation reshapes the fall to suit its own needs, some as a warning against decadence, others as proof of resilience. The gaps in the record, the contradictions in the sources, leave room for interpretation, for conspiracy, for the suspicion that the full truth was never written down. The fall of the Roman Empire is not just a historical event, it is a mirror. It reflects the psychology of power, the allure of denial, and the ways in which leaders manipulate perception to maintain control. It is a reminder that collapse is rarely sudden, that the signs are visible long before the end, and that the greatest cover-up of all may be convincing people that nothing is wrong until it is too late. And perhaps that is why the story still grips us. Because in the quiet corridors of history, Rome whispers a warning that no empire falls in a single night, and that the most dangerous enemy is the one you refuse to see. The mysterious death of Napoleon. On May 5, 1821, on the remote island of St. Helena, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had once ruled an empire stretching across Europe, drew his final breath. Officially, the cause was recorded as stomach cancer, the same illness that had claimed his father. But from the moment the news reached the world, whispers began. Whispers that the emperor had not simply died of disease, but had been silenced. Napoleon's exile to St. Helena was meant to be the end of his story. After his defeat at Waterloo, the British chose this isolated volcanic rock in the South Atlantic precisely because escape was impossible. Surrounded by sheer cliffs, patrolled by warships, and watched by guards, Napoleon was a prisoner in all but name. Yet even in captivity, he remained a symbol, dangerous not for what he could do, but for what he represented. His very existence was a rallying point for loyalists across Europe. From a psychological perspective, this is where the intrigue begins. When a figure inspires such devotion, their enemies often fear not just their actions, but their potential. The idea of Napoleon returning to power was enough to unsettle the fragile balance of post-war Europe. And so, some argue, it was safer for him to die sooner rather than later. The accounts of his final years are filled with contradictions. Napoleon complained of chronic stomach pain, fatigue, and depression. His health declined steadily, but not in a way that convinced everyone it was purely natural. Visitors described his face as pale and bloated, his hair thinning, his body wasting away. Yet his mind remained sharp, and he spoke often of his legacy, dictating memoirs that painted him as a visionary betrayed by lesser men. Then came the detail that would fuel decades of speculation. After his death, locks of Napoleon's hair were taken as mementos. Years later, when these strands were tested, they were found to contain unusually high levels of arsenic. Arsenic, an infamous poison of the era, slow-acting, capable of mimicking the symptoms of illness. The psychological profile of such a poisoning is chilling. Arsenic doesn't kill instantly. It erodes the body over time, creating a plausible cover of natural decline. To the outside world, the victim appears to be dying of disease. To the perpetrator, it offers control, an invisible hand guiding the pace of death. But who would have done it? Theories abound. Some point to the British, eager to ensure Napoleon could never return to the political stage. Others suggest internal betrayal, perhaps a member of his own entourage, acting out of ambition, resentment, or under foreign influence. There is even the possibility of accidental poisoning, as arsenic was present in dyes, wallpapers, and medicines of the time. The cover-up, if there was one, was subtle. No dramatic silencing, no public scandal, just a quiet death on a distant island, followed by a burial under British watch. The official autopsy, conducted by Napoleon's personal physician and British doctors, concluded stomach cancer. Yet even this report contained oddities, descriptions of a stomach lining that didn't match typical cancer cases, and conflicting notes about the state of his organs. From a psychological standpoint, the power of the mystery lies in its ambiguity. The human mind struggles with uncertainty, especially when it involves a figure as monumental as Napoleon. A simple death by illness feels unsatisfying for a man whose life was defined by drama and upheaval. The idea of assassination, of a hidden hand removing him from the board, fits more neatly into the narrative of his life. And then there is the question of Napoleon himself. In his final months, he reportedly told those close to him that he believed he was being poisoned. Was this paranoia born of isolation, or a clear-eyed assessment of his situation? The mind, under the strain of exile and illness, can magnify suspicion. But history has shown that sometimes, the paranoid are simply those who see the truth before others do. The intrigue deepens when we consider the political climate of 1821. Europe was in a delicate state, with monarchies restored and revolutionary movements simmering beneath the surface. Napoleon's death removed a potential catalyst for unrest. Whether by design or by fate, his passing served the interests of those who feared the return of his influence. Even in death, the mystery persisted. In 1840, Napoleon's body was exhumed and returned to France in a grand ceremony. Witnesses claimed his remains were astonishingly well preserved, as if untouched by time. To some, this was proof of arsenic poisoning, which can slow decomposition. To others, it was simply the result of the island's soil and coffin construction. But the image of the emperor lying almost as he had in life only added to the legend. The psychology of legacy plays a final role here. Napoleon understood the power of myth. In life, he crafted his image carefully. In death, the uncertainty surrounding his fate ensured that image would endure. A clean, clinical death might have closed the book. A mysterious one kept the story alive, inviting each generation to revisit it, to argue, to imagine. The mysterious death of Napoleon is not just a question of what happened on St. Helena. It is a study in how power, fear, and narrative intertwine. It shows how the absence of definitive truth creates a vacuum that human imagination rushes to fill. It reminds us that history is not only written by the victors, but also shaped by the questions they leave unanswered. And perhaps that is the final irony. Whether Napoleon died of cancer, poison, or some combination of both, the uncertainty has made him immortal in a way no empire could. His body may have been confined to an island, but his story escaped, carried on the currents of mystery, intrigue, and the enduring human need to believe that great men do not simply fade away. They are taken by fate or by design, leaving behind a shadow that never stops moving. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. It was June 28, 1914, in Sarajevo, a city simmering with political tension. The Archduke, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had come to observe military exercises and strengthen imperial presence in a region where nationalism was rising like a tide. He rode in an open-top car alongside his wife, Sophie, unaware that the day's events would ignite a chain reaction leading to one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. The morning began with a failed attempt. A conspirator from the secret nationalist group known as the Black Hand hurled a grenade at the Archduke's motorcade. It missed, injuring bystanders instead. The would-be assassin swallowed a cyanide pill and jumped into a river, only to survive both. The Archduke, shaken but unhurt, continued with his schedule. This decision, from a psychological standpoint, is telling. Leaders often feel compelled to project control in the face of danger, to show they are unshaken. But that same instinct can lead them straight into greater peril. Later, after visiting the wounded in the hospital, the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn. In a twist of fate, the car stopped directly in front of Gavrilo Princip, another member of the Black Hand, standing outside a cafe. Princip seized the moment, stepped forward, and fired 2 shots. One struck Sophie, the other the Archduke. Within minutes, both were dead. On the surface, it was a tragic but straightforward act of political violence. Yet the deeper you look, the more the story becomes a web of mystery, cover-up, and intrigue. The Black Hand was no ordinary nationalist group. It was tied to elements within the Serbian military and intelligence services. This connection raises the first question. Was the assassination purely the work of young radicals, or was it part of a larger, state-backed operation? The official Serbian government denied involvement, but the lines between rogue agents and official policy were blurred. In the world of espionage and covert action, plausible deniability is a weapon. From a psychological perspective, the conspirators were driven by a potent mix of youthful idealism, resentment, and the intoxicating belief that a single act could change the course of history. This is the mindset of the political assassin, The conviction that violence is not just justified, but necessary. It's a dangerous form of cognitive narrowing, where all other solutions vanish in the glare of a single, radical objective. The Austro-Hungarian Empire's reaction was swift but calculated. They framed the assassination as a direct attack by Serbia itself, using it as a pretext to issue an ultimatum so severe it was almost certain to be rejected. This was not just grief, it was strategy. The assassination became a tool, a justification for war that many in Vienna's leadership already desired. Here lies the intrigue. Did certain figures within the empire see the Archduke's death as an opportunity rather than a tragedy? Franz Ferdinand was known for his relatively moderate stance toward the Slavic provinces. His assassination removed a potential obstacle to more aggressive policies. In this light, the cover-up may not have been about hiding who killed him. It may have been about controlling how his death was used. The investigation into the killing was limited, and much of the evidence was filtered through political agendas. Witnesses were pressured, confessions extracted under questionable circumstances, and the narrative shaped to fit the needs of those in power. The psychology of propaganda was at work. Simplify the story, assign blame, and rally the public behind a cause. The assassination also reveals the role of coincidence in history. If the driver had not taken a wrong turn, if Princip had not been in that exact spot, the shots might never have been fired. Yet in the aftermath, these coincidences were overshadowed by the narrative of inevitability. People prefer to believe in grand designs rather than random chance. It makes events feel more comprehensible, even when the truth is messier. The cover-up theories extend beyond Serbia and Austria-Hungary. Some have speculated that other powers, aware of the tensions in the Balkans, allowed the assassination to happen, or even encouraged it, knowing it could trigger a larger conflict that might serve their interests. While hard evidence is scarce, the idea persists because it fits a pattern seen throughout history: crises exploited by those prepared to benefit from them. From a psychological standpoint, the assassination is also a study in escalation. A single act of violence, committed by a 19-year-old with a pistol, spiraled into a global war that claimed millions of lives. This is the danger of what psychologists call group entrenchment. Once a narrative of blame takes hold, leaders feel trapped by their own rhetoric, unable to back down without appearing weak. In the days after the assassination, Vienna's streets were filled with mourning, but also with a sense of grim resolve. Newspapers printed inflammatory headlines, stoking anger towards Serbia. Behind closed doors, diplomats and generals mapped out the path to war. The Archduke's death had become more than a crime. It was a catalyst, a symbol, and a justification. The mystery that lingers is not who pulled the trigger, that much is known, but how many hands guided the events that led to that moment. Was Princip merely a pawn in a game far larger than he understood? Did the powers that be, on both sides, allow the pieces to fall into place because they saw advantage in the chaos? The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is remembered as the spark that lit the fuse of World War I. But beneath that simple cause and effect lies a far more complex reality, one where psychology, political ambition, and the shadows of covert action intertwine. It is a reminder that history is rarely as straightforward as it appears, and that behind every public tragedy, there may be hidden motives, concealed truths, and unanswered questions. And perhaps that is why the story endures. It is not just about a man and a moment. It is about the forces that shape events from behind the curtain, the human minds that justify the unthinkable, and the way a single act can be transformed into a narrative powerful enough to change the world. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln. On the night of April 14, 1865, the air in Washington, D.C. was thick with celebration. The Civil War was all but over. The Union had triumphed, and President Abraham Lincoln, weary but resolute, sought a brief escape from the weight of history. He and his wife attended a play at Ford's Theater, Our American Cousin. It was meant to be an evening of laughter. Instead, it became one of the most shocking nights in American history. At 10:15 p.m., as the audience roared with laughter at a well-timed joke, a man slipped into the presidential box. John Wilkes Booth, actor, Confederate sympathizer, and a man consumed by a dangerous blend of ideology and ego, fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. The president slumped forward, unconscious. Booth leapt to the stage, shouting words that would echo through time, and vanished into the chaos. From a psychological perspective, Booth's act was not just political, it was deeply personal. He saw himself as a tragic hero, a man destined to alter the course of history. This is the dangerous allure of extremist thinking, the belief that one's own moral vision justifies any act, no matter how violent. Booth's mind had been shaped by the Confederacy's collapse, by the humiliation of defeat, and by his own craving for immortality. Killing Lincoln, in his mind, was not murder, it was theater. But the intrigue doesn't end with the shot. Booth was not acting alone. He was part of a wider conspiracy to decapitate the Union government. That same night, other conspirators attempted to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. The plan was to throw the government into chaos, giving the Confederacy, or at least its ideals, a chance to rise again. Only Booth succeeded. The cover-up began almost immediately, not to protect Booth, but to control the narrative. In the hours after the assassination, Washington was gripped by fear. Rumors spread of Confederate armies marching on the Capitol, of foreign agents at work, of a coup in progress. The government needed to project control, to show that justice would be swift. But in doing so, they also shaped the story in ways that left gaps that would feed speculation for generations. Booth's escape was a drama in itself. He fled on horseback, aided by a network of sympathizers. For 12 days, he evaded one of the largest manhunts in American history. The psychology of the fugitive is a study in contrasts, paranoia and arrogance, fear and exhilaration. Booth kept a diary during his flight, justifying his actions, casting himself as a martyr. Even as the net closed in, he clung to the belief that history would vindicate him. When Union soldiers finally cornered him in a Virginia barn, Booth refused to surrender. The barn was set ablaze, and a single shot brought him down. Officially, he was killed by Sergeant Boston Corbett. But here, too, the mystery deepens. Some accounts suggest Booth was captured alive, others that he took his own life. The chaos of that night, and the government's eagerness to close the case, left room for doubt. And then there are the conspiracy theories. Whispers that Booth escaped entirely, that the man killed in the barn was a double, that Booth lived out his days under an assumed name. These theories persist because the official record leaves unanswered questions. Why were some of Booth's known associates never fully investigated? Why were certain documents sealed for decades? Was there more to the plot than the public was told? From a psychological standpoint, the assassination also reveals the fragility of perceived safety. Lincoln was the most protected man in the nation, yet his killer walked into his presence without resistance. The Secret Service, as we know it today, did not exist. Security was minimal, and the idea of a president being murdered in public seemed unthinkable. That illusion shattered in an instant, changing forever how leaders would be guarded. The aftermath was as much about controlling emotion as it was about finding the truth. Lincoln's death plunged the nation into mourning, but it also created a political vacuum. Reconstruction was about to begin, and with Lincoln gone, the tone of that process shifted dramatically. Some historians argue that his assassination altered the course of post-war America as profoundly as the war itself. The cover-up theories often focus on this shift. Was Booth's conspiracy truly a small band of fanatics, or was it part of a larger, more organized effort to shape the future of the nation? The lack of transparency in the investigation, closed trials, swift executions, and sealed evidence only fuels the suspicion. In the public mind, secrecy and guilt often walk hand in hand. There's also the enduring mystery of Mary Surratt, the boarding house owner convicted and hanged for her role in the plot. To this day, debate rages over whether she was a willing conspirator or an innocent caught in the web. Her execution, the first of a woman by the U.S. government, was swift and controversial, adding another layer of intrigue to an already tangled story. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln is not just a historical event, it's a psychological labyrinth. It's about how ideology can warp perception, how fear can be weaponized, and how the truth can be obscured by the very institutions tasked with uncovering it. It's about the human need for closure and how, in its absence, we create our own narratives. More than 160 years later, the echoes of that night still resonate. The image of Lincoln, slumped in his chair at Ford's Theater, is etched into the American consciousness. Booth's leap to the stage is frozen in time, a moment where theater and reality collided in the most violent way imaginable. And the unanswered questions about who knew what and when ensure that the story remains alive, not just in history books, but in the restless imagination of a nation. Perhaps that is the final, most haunting truth. The assassination was not just the end of a life, but the beginning of a mystery. One that blends psychology, conspiracy, and the shadows of power into a story that refuses to fade. The mysterious Dyatlov Pass incident. In February 1959, 9 experienced hikers set out into the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. Led by Igor Dyatlov, they were young, skilled, and well prepared for the brutal winter conditions. Their goal was to reach O'Torton Mountain, a remote and challenging destination. They never made it. What happened to them in those frozen hills has become one of the most enduring and unsettling mysteries of the 20th century. When the group failed to return, search teams were dispatched. Weeks later, rescuers found their campsite and immediately knew something was wrong. The tent was still standing, but it had been slashed open from the inside. Inside were boots, coats, and supplies, as if the hikers had fled in a hurry into sub-zero temperatures, wearing little more than underclothes. From a psychological perspective, this is the first fracture in the story. In extreme cold, abandoning shelter and warm clothing is almost certain death. For trained hikers, it's unthinkable, unless something inside the tent was more terrifying than the freezing night outside. The searchers followed footprints in the snow, leading into the forest. The first bodies were found under a cedar tree, barefoot, wearing only light clothing. Nearby, branches were broken high above the ground, suggesting someone had climbed in desperation, perhaps to look for something or to escape it. As more bodies were discovered, the mystery deepened. Some had severe internal injuries, broken ribs, crushed skulls, yet no external wounds, as if they had been hit by a force that left no mark. One woman was missing her tongue. Traces of radiation were found on some of the clothing, and the positions of the bodies suggested they had been trying to return to the tent when they died. The official investigation concluded that the hikers died from a compelling natural force. But what force? The phrase was vague, almost evasive, and it left room for endless speculation. The psychology of uncertainty is powerful. When facts are incomplete, the mind fills the gaps with possibilities. In the Dyatlov case, those possibilities multiplied. An avalanche, a military weapons test gone wrong, an attack by local tribes, a secret KGB operation, even encounters with something not of this world. Each theory had fragments of evidence, but none fit perfectly. The avalanche theory explains the sudden flight from the tent, but not the lack of snow damage to the campsite, nor the strange injuries. A military cover-up could explain the radiation and the secrecy, but why leave the bodies to be found at all? And the more outlandish theories, while compelling, rested on the same foundation of unanswered questions. The cover-up narrative gained strength from the Soviet handling of the case. Files were classified, witnesses were silenced, and the pass itself was closed to the public for years. When the documents were eventually released, they were incomplete, with key pages missing. This selective disclosure created the impression that something was being hidden, whether or not that was true. From a psychological standpoint, secrecy breeds suspicion. The less information people have, the more they assume there is something to hide. In the Dyatlov case, the combination of bizarre evidence and official vagueness created the perfect environment for conspiracy theories to thrive. There's also the human tendency to seek meaning in tragedy. The hikers were young, intelligent, and full of life. Their deaths were senseless, and senselessness is hard to accept. By imagining a cause, whether it's a government experiment, a supernatural force, or a freak natural event, we impose order on chaos. It's a way of making the unbearable slightly more bearable. But the psychological dimension doesn't end with the victims. Consider the rescuers stumbling upon that tent in the snow, the slashes from the inside, the scattered belongings, the footprints leading away. Each discovery would have been a shock, each body a puzzle piece that didn't fit. The mind, confronted with something it can't explain, begins to loop, replaying the scene, searching for a pattern that isn't there. Even decades later, The Dyatlov Pass incident continues to exert a strange pull. New theories emerge, old ones are re-examined, and the debate never truly ends. Part of this is because the evidence is frozen in time, literally and figuratively. The mountains have kept their secrets well. Some modern researchers suggest a rare type of avalanche or a sudden wind phenomenon known as a katabatic wind, capable of causing panic and disorientation. These explanations are plausible, but they lack the drama of the more sensational theories. And in the realm of public imagination, drama often wins over probability. The intrigue lies in the contradictions. A group of skilled hikers behaving irrationally. Injuries that suggest both violence and accident. Evidence that points in multiple directions at once. And an official conclusion that answers nothing. In the end, the Dyatlov Pass incident is more than a mystery. It's a mirror reflecting our relationship with the unknown. It shows how we respond when confronted with something that defies explanation. We speculate, we theorize, we argue, and we keep searching. The truth may be simple, or it may be stranger than we can imagine. But as long as the questions remain, the story will live on. Somewhere in those frozen hills, the wind still moves through the trees, and the snow still covers the ground where 9 lives ended in confusion and fear. The mountain has no need to explain itself, and perhaps that is the most unsettling part. Nature, secrecy, and human psychology combining to create a mystery that refuses to die. The Great Smog of London in 1952. It began on December 5th, with a cold, still air settling over the city. Londoners woke to a thick yellow haze clinging to the streets, the kind of fog they'd seen before, only heavier, denser, and strangely suffocating. At first, it was an inconvenience. Buses slowed, street lamps glowed dimly through the murk, and pedestrians moved like shadows in a dream. But as the hours passed, the fog deepened into something far more sinister. This was not just weather. It was a killer. The smog was a toxic brew, coal smoke from millions of fireplaces, industrial emissions from factories, and exhaust from vehicles, all trapped by a temperature inversion that sealed the city under a lid of stagnant air. The result was a chemical soup so thick you could barely see your own feet. People described it as a wall, opaque, choking, and inescapable. From a psychological perspective, the first danger was denial. London had a long history of pea soupers, fogs tinted by coal smoke. Residents were accustomed to them, even romanticized them. That familiarity dulled the sense of urgency. People went about their routines, unaware that each breath was filling their lungs with microscopic particles and acidic gases. The human mind tends to normalize the familiar, even when it turns deadly. By the second day, the city was paralyzed. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Drivers abandoned their cars in the streets. Ambulances crawled through the gloom, sirens muffled by the dense air. Inside homes, the smog seeped through cracks and under doors, turning curtains yellow and leaving a bitter taste in the mouth. Hospitals began to fill with patients struggling to breathe, children, the elderly, and those with heart or lung conditions collapsing in alarming numbers. And yet, the official response was muted. The government issued no immediate warnings, no orders to stay indoors. The cover-up, if it can be called that, was one of omission. Admitting the scale of the crisis would have meant acknowledging the role of coal burning and industrial pollution, issues tied directly to policy, economics, and national pride. Instead, the smog was treated as an unfortunate but temporary inconvenience. The psychology of authority plays a role here. People look to leaders for cues on how to react. When officials downplay a threat, the public often follows suit, even when their senses tell them otherwise. In 1952, that meant thousands continued to breathe the poisoned air, unaware of the damage being done in real time. By the third day, the smog had become a living thing. It crept into theaters, forcing performances to stop. It invaded train stations, where passengers stumbled along platforms, unable to see the trains until they were inches away. In some neighborhoods, you could not see your own hands. The darkness was so complete that people lit candles at midday. The death toll rose quietly. Doctors saw patients with lips turning blue, coughing up blackened mucus. Some died within hours of exposure. Others lingered for days. The smog didn't just kill, it suffocated slowly, inflaming lungs and triggering heart failure. And still, there was no public admission of the scale of the disaster. When the wind finally shifted on December 9th, the smog began to lift. London emerged into weak winter sunlight, the air clearing as if nothing had happened. But the aftermath told a different story. In the weeks that followed, more than 4,000 people were dead. Later studies suggested the true number may have been closer to 12,000, with tens of thousands more suffering long-term health effects. The intrigue lies in what happened next, or rather, what didn't happen. There was no immediate overhaul of environmental policy, no sweeping ban on coal burning. The government's initial reports minimized the death toll, framing the event as an unfortunate act of nature rather than a man-made catastrophe. It would take years and mounting public pressure before the Clean Air Act of 1956 began to address the root causes. Why the delay? Part of it was political self-preservation. Britain's post-war economy depended heavily on coal, both for industry and for heating homes. Admitting that coal smoke had killed thousands would have meant confronting the need for costly reforms and risking public backlash. There was also the psychological barrier of collective guilt. If the smog was man-made, then every coal fire in every home had played a part. It was easier, for many, to believe it was simply the weather. The Great Smog also reveals the human tendency to underestimate invisible threats. Unlike a fire or a flood, air pollution doesn't announce itself with dramatic visuals, at least, not until it's too late. The smog was visible, yes, but its true danger was microscopic, hidden in particles too small to see. That invisibility allowed it to slip past the mental alarms that normally trigger survival instincts. Even decades later, the event retains an air of mystery. Some researchers believe the official death toll was deliberately kept low to avoid panic. Others point to inconsistencies in hospital records and mortality reports, suggesting that the full scale of the disaster was quietly buried. The truth may never be fully known, because the smog's victims were not all counted in the moment. They were scattered across time, their deaths folded into statistics on pneumonia, bronchitis, and heart disease. From a psychological standpoint, the Great Smog is a case study in how societies process disaster. At first, there is denial. Then, as the evidence becomes undeniable, there is fear. Finally, there is the rewriting of the narrative, transforming a preventable tragedy into an unavoidable act of fate. This rewriting serves to protect both the public psyche and those in power, but it also ensures that the lessons are learned too slowly. The Great Smog of 1952 was not just a weather event. It was a mirror held up to a city, reflecting the cost of complacency, the fragility of trust in authority, and the danger of ignoring what we cannot or will not see. It remains one of the clearest examples of how mystery, cover-up, and human psychology intertwine, leaving behind not just a historical record, but a warning that still hangs in the air. The bizarre Voynich manuscript. It sits in a climate-controlled vault at Yale University, locked away like a relic from another world. A book of just over 200 pages, written in an unknown script, filled with strange illustrations of plants that don't exist, astronomical charts that defy known systems, and human figures engaged in rituals no one can fully explain. Its pages are vellum, carbon dated to the early 15th century. But everything else about it, the language, the purpose, the author, remains a mystery. The first thing that strikes you when you see it is the writing. Line after line of looping, fluid characters, arranged with the precision of a real language. But no one has ever been able to read it. Cryptographers, linguists, mathematicians, even codebreakers from wartime intelligence agencies have tried. The symbols don't match any known alphabet. The patterns suggest grammar, but the meaning remains locked away. It's as if the book is speaking, but in a voice from a world we've never visited. From a psychological perspective, this is where the obsession begins. The human brain is wired to seek patterns, to decode the unknown. When confronted with something that looks like language but refuses to yield meaning, the mind can't let go. It becomes a puzzle that demands solving, not just for knowledge, but for the satisfaction of breaking through the wall of secrecy. The illustrations only deepen the intrigue. Some pages show plants with roots, stems, and flowers, but none match any species on Earth. Others depict naked women bathing in pools connected by elaborate plumbing systems, as if part of some forgotten ritual. There are zodiac-like diagrams, but the constellations are wrong, the symbols unfamiliar. It's a visual language as impenetrable as the text itself. The mystery is compounded by the book's history, or rather, its lack of one. It surfaced in 1912 when a rare book dealer named Wilfred Voynich acquired it from a Jesuit college in Italy. Voynich believed it was the work of a Renaissance genius, perhaps even Roger Bacon, and that it contained lost scientific knowledge. But the trail before that is faint, a scattering of letters and ownership marks that raise more questions than they answer. And then there's the possibility of a cover-up. Some researchers have suggested that the manuscript's origins were deliberately obscured, its chain of custody manipulated to hide its true purpose. Was it a coded medical text, meant to conceal dangerous knowledge from the church? A political cipher, its meaning erased by time? Or was it something more esoteric, a work of alchemy, magic, or secret philosophy, designed to be understood only by a select few? The psychology of secrecy is powerful. When information is hidden, it gains value. The Voynich manuscript may have been created not just to record knowledge, but to protect it, ensuring that only those with the key could unlock its meaning. That key, if it ever existed, has been lost for centuries. Some believe the manuscript is an elaborate hoax, a meaningless jumble of symbols designed to mimic language. But if that's true, it's a hoax of staggering complexity. Statistical analysis of the text shows patterns similar to real languages, word frequencies, structural repetitions, and variations that would be almost impossible to fake without a deep understanding of linguistics. If it is nonsense, it's nonsense crafted with genius-level precision. The intrigue deepens when you consider the human cost of the search for answers. Brilliant minds have spent decades chasing the manuscript's secrets, only to emerge empty-handed. Some have ruined reputations by claiming to have solved it, only to be disproven. Others have fallen into obsession, convinced that the book is speaking directly to them, that they are on the verge of a breakthrough. The manuscript doesn't just resist translation, it resists surrender. There's also the unsettling possibility that the book is not meant for us at all. Its language, its imagery, its structure. What if they were created for a culture, a worldview, or even a species entirely different from our own? The human mind assumes that all human-made things are meant to be understood by other humans. The Voynich manuscript challenges that assumption, and in doing so, it unsettles something deep within us. And yet, the cover-up theories persist. Some whisper that the manuscript has already been deciphered, but the results were too dangerous, too destabilizing to release. Others suggest it contains knowledge, medical, astronomical, or even prophetic, that certain powers would prefer to keep hidden. In this view, the mystery is not a failure of understanding, but a deliberate act of suppression. From a psychological standpoint, this is the perfect storm, a tangible object, undeniably real, that offers just enough clues to suggest meaning, but never enough to confirm it. It invites endless speculation, fuels conspiracy, and keeps the mind circling back, unable to let go. The Voynich manuscript is more than an unsolved puzzle, it's a mirror. It reflects our need for answers, our discomfort with uncertainty, and our willingness to weave stories in the absence of facts. It shows how mystery can be more powerful than truth, how the unknown can hold us in its grip long after the search for answers has failed. And perhaps that is its true purpose. Whether it was created as a code, a hoax, a scientific record, or something else entirely, the manuscript has achieved something rare. It has made itself immortal. As long as it remains unreadable, it will remain alive, whispering from its pages, daring us to try again and again and again. Somewhere, in the looping script and impossible plants, there may be a message waiting. Or perhaps the message is the chase itself, the endless pursuit of meaning in a world that will never give us all the answers. And that, in its own way, is the most human mystery of all: the strange disappearance of Amelia Earhart. On July 2nd, 1937, the world's most famous female aviator took off from New Guinea, with her navigator, Fred Noonan, on one of the final legs of an ambitious journey to circumnavigate the globe. Their destination was Howland Island, a tiny speck in the Pacific, barely large enough to land a plane. The Lockheed Electra lifted into the morning sky, engine steady, radio checks complete. It was supposed to be a routine flight. It became one of the greatest mysteries in aviation history. Earhart was more than a pilot. She was a symbol, a pioneer who defied the limits placed on women, a public figure who inspired millions. Her disappearance was not just a loss, it was a rupture in the collective imagination. And that is where the psychology of this story begins. The Pacific that day was vast and indifferent. Navigation in 1937 relied on celestial readings, dead reckoning, and radio signals. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Itasca waited near Howland Island, ready to guide her in. But as the hours passed, the radio exchanges grew tense. Earhart's voice came through, calm but urgent. They were running low on fuel, unable to find the island. The Itasca transmitted bearings, but Earhart either couldn't hear them or couldn't interpret them. The last transmission was chilling in its simplicity. "We are running north and south." Then, silence. From a psychological perspective, those final moments are haunting. Imagine the mental strain. The endless ocean below, the fuel gauges dropping, the horizon offering no sign of land. Under extreme stress, human perception narrows. Decision-making becomes reactive. Even the most skilled pilots can fall victim to tunnel vision, focusing on one solution while ignoring alternatives. Earhart and Noonan may have been locked into a search pattern that, without correction, sealed their fate. The official search was massive: ships, planes, and thousands of personnel scouring the ocean. Nothing was found. No wreckage, no bodies, no definitive trace. And in that void, the intrigue took root. One theory says they crashed into the sea near Howland, the Electra sinking quickly into deep water. Simple, tragic, and plausible. But simplicity rarely satisfies the human mind when a story is this large. We crave complexity, hidden motives, and secrets. And so, other theories emerged. Some claimed Earhart and Noonan landed on an uninhabited island, surviving for days or weeks before succumbing to hunger and exposure. Others suggested they were captured by Japanese forces, suspected of espionage, and executed in secret. This theory gained traction because of the political climate. Tensions in the Pacific were rising, and the idea of a covert mission disguised as a record-setting flight was irresistible to those who saw patterns in the shadows. The psychology of conspiracy thrives on ambiguity. The less evidence there is, the more room there is for imagination. In Earhart's case, the absence of proof became proof in itself for those convinced of a cover-up. Why? They asked. Did certain military files remain classified for decades? Why were some search records incomplete or missing? Was the U.S. government hiding the truth to avoid diplomatic fallout? There's also the matter of Earhart's public image. She was a national hero, a role model. Admitting she had died in a simple navigational mishap might have felt anticlimactic, even damaging. A more mysterious ending preserved her legend, allowing her to remain larger than life. In this way, the lack of closure served both the myth and the memory. From a psychological standpoint, the disappearance also reveals how we project ourselves onto mysteries. For some, Earhart's fate is a story of courage to the end, fighting until the last drop of fuel. For others, it's a cautionary tale about overconfidence and the limits of human skill. The truth could be either or neither, but in the absence of facts, we choose the version that resonates with our own beliefs about risk, ambition, and destiny. The intrigue deepens when you consider the fragments of possible evidence that have surfaced over the years. A piece of aluminum found on a remote atoll, skeletal remains misidentified and later re-examined, anecdotal accounts from islanders who claim to have seen a strange plane overhead. Each clue is tantalizing, but none are definitive. And so the mystery remains suspended, never solved, never entirely cold. There's a concept in psychology called the Zeigarnik effect, the tendency to remember unfinished stories more vividly than completed ones. Earhart's disappearance is the ultimate unfinished story. It lingers in the mind because it denies resolution. Every new theory, every scrap of evidence, reopens the case in our imagination. And perhaps that is why the idea of a cover-up endures. If the truth were known, the story would end. But as long as there is doubt, the legend lives. Governments, historians, and amateur sleuths all play their part, some seeking answers, others perhaps content to let the mystery breathe. In the end, The strange disappearance of Amelia Earhart is more than a historical puzzle. It is a mirror reflecting our fascination with the unknown, our suspicion of official narratives, and our need to find meaning in loss. Whether she lies at the bottom of the Pacific, rests on a forgotten island, or met a fate stranger still, her story continues to fly, untethered, elusive, and forever just beyond the horizon. And maybe that's the final, most haunting truth. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved. They are meant to remind us that even in an age of maps and measurements, there are still places and people that can vanish into the blue, leaving only questions in their wake. The Great Train Robbery. In the early hours of August 8, 1963, a Royal Mail train was making its routine overnight journey from Glasgow to London. It carried no passengers, only postal workers and a fortune in cash. Over £2.6 million in banknotes, the equivalent of tens of millions today, sat locked in its carriages. It was supposed to be an unremarkable trip. Instead, it became one of the most audacious crimes in British history. At 3 a.m., the train approached a remote stretch of track near Ledburn, Buckinghamshire. The signal ahead glowed red, forcing the driver to slow and stop. What he didn't know was that the signal had been tampered with. In the shadows, a team of masked men waited. They had studied the train's schedule, its cargo, and even the habits of its crew. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was a crime of meticulous design. The robbers boarded quickly, overpowering the driver and detaching the first two carriages. They moved the train forward to a pre-selected spot under a bridge, out of sight from the main line. There, they unloaded sack after sack of banknotes into waiting vehicles. The entire operation took barely half an hour. No guns were fired. No one was killed. And yet, the psychological impact was seismic. The public was fascinated. Here was a crime that seemed almost cinematic, precise, daring, and, at least on the surface, bloodless. But beneath the glamour was something darker. The robbers had trained for months, rehearsing their moves like a military unit. They had studied not just the train, but human behavior. How to intimidate without firing a shot, how to control a group of people with minimal force, how to keep fear sharp but contained. Psychologists call this command presence, the ability to project authority so strongly that resistance feels impossible. The robbers used it expertly. Postal workers were ordered to lie down, their movements controlled, their voices silenced. In those moments, the victim's survival instincts overrode any thought of defiance. The gang escaped to a nearby hideout, a farmhouse where they planned to lay low until the heat died down. But here, the psychology shifted. The adrenaline of the heist gave way to the paranoia of being hunted. Every sound outside became a threat. Every unfamiliar car was a possible police tail. And paranoia breeds mistakes. Within days, the police found the hideout. They discovered fingerprints on dishes, bottles, and even a Monopoly board the gang had used to pass the time. The game pieces were replaced with real cash, a mocking nod to their haul, but it was also their undoing. One by one, the robbers were tracked down and arrested. Yet even in custody, the intrigue deepened. Not all of the gang was caught. Not all of the money was recovered. And questions began to surface about whether the full truth had been told. Some believed there were more people involved, insiders who had provided information about the train's cargo and schedule. Others suspected that certain figures had been quietly protected, their names kept out of the official record. The cover-up theories grew when key evidence seemed to vanish, and when some suspects received surprisingly light sentences compared to others. Was it incompetence, or was someone pulling strings behind the scenes? The idea that the robbery might have been bigger than the men in the dock gave the story a second life, one that blurred the line between fact and legend. From a psychological perspective, the Great Train Robbery is a study in group dynamics under pressure. The gang's success depended on absolute trust. Each man had to believe the others would do their part without hesitation. But once the job was done, that trust began to fracture. Fear of betrayal, fear of capture, and the lure of keeping a larger share of the money all worked against them. In the end, it wasn't just the police that brought them down. It was the human tendency to crack under sustained stress. The mystery of the missing money remains one of the most tantalizing threads. Millions vanished into the shadows, never to be found. Did it end up buried in fields, hidden in walls, smuggled overseas? Or was it quietly laundered through businesses and investments, its origins erased? The lack of closure keeps the story alive because the human mind hates loose ends. We want to believe the treasure is still out there, waiting to be discovered. Even decades later, the Great Train Robbery holds a strange place in the public imagination. It is remembered as both a daring caper and a cautionary tale. The robbers became folk antiheroes to some, symbols of rebellion against authority. But the reality was far less romantic. Lives were ruined, families torn apart, and the money that seemed like freedom became a curse. The intrigue lies in the contradictions. A crime that was planned with military precision, yet undone by something as simple as fingerprints on a board game. A heist that seemed victimless, yet left deep psychological scars on those who lived through it. A case that was supposedly solved, yet still feels incomplete. And perhaps that is why the Great Train Robbery endures. It is not just a story about stolen money. It is a story about human nature. About how greed can unite people for a moment, then tear them apart. About how the thrill of control can give way to the terror of losing it. And about how, in the end, the most valuable thing stolen that night might not have been the cash, but the sense of security that ordinary people once felt. Somewhere, in the quiet spaces between the official reports and the whispered rumors, the full truth waits. Whether it will ever be found is another matter. Until then, the Great Train Robbery remains what it has always been. A perfect blend of psychology, mystery, cover-up, and intrigue, rolling forever through the tracks of history. The Great Chicago Tylenol Murders. In late September of 1982, Chicago was gripped by a fear unlike anything it had ever known. It began quietly, one death, then another, then another. Perfectly healthy people, collapsing without warning. The only connection between them was chilling in its simplicity. Each had taken an extra-strength Tylenol capsule within hours of their death. At first, no one could believe it. Tylenol was a household name, trusted by millions. But toxicology reports revealed the truth. Those capsules had been laced with potassium cyanide, a poison so lethal that a single grain could kill in minutes. The victims never stood a chance. The psychology of the crime was as terrifying as the act itself. This wasn't a targeted attack. It was random, faceless, and invisible. Anyone could be next. The killer didn't need to know you, didn't need to be near you. All they needed was for you to trust the safety of something you'd taken 100 times before. That trust became the weapon. The randomness created a unique kind of panic. In crimes of passion or revenge, the danger feels contained. You can tell yourself you're not the target. But here, the target was everyone. Parents threw away medicine cabinets full of pills. Store shelves were stripped bare. People whispered about shadowy figures slipping into pharmacies at night, tampering with bottles. The official investigation moved fast. Johnson & Johnson, the maker of Tylenol, issued an unprecedented nationwide recall, 31 million bottles pulled from shelves. Police and FBI agents swarmed the city, interviewing store clerks, tracing distribution routes, and testing thousands of capsules. But the killer had left no fingerprints, no surveillance footage, no witnesses. The poisonings seemed to have been carried out with surgical precision. Bottles purchased, capsules opened and filled with cyanide, then returned to store shelves for unsuspecting customers to buy. The psychology of such a killer is complex. This was not a crime of impulse. It required planning, patience, and a willingness to kill indiscriminately. Experts debated whether the motive was personal, political, or simply the pursuit of chaos. Some profilers suggested the killer might have been motivated by a godlike sense of control, the power to decide who lived and who died, without ever being seen. Then came the letters. A man named James William Lewis sent an extortion note to Johnson & Johnson, demanding $1 million to stop the killings. He was arrested and convicted, not for murder, but for extortion. He denied being the poisoner, and no evidence ever tied him directly to the deaths. The public was left with a suspect who might not have been the killer, and a killer who might still have been free. The cover-up, if there was one, was subtle. Officially, the case remains unsolved. But over the years, whispers have persisted, claims that authorities knew more than they revealed, that certain leads were quietly dropped, that the full truth was buried to prevent further panic. Some believe the killer was identified but never charged due to lack of evidence. others that the murders were part of a larger, unacknowledged pattern of product tampering across the country. What makes the Tylenol murders so haunting is the way they changed the psychology of trust. Before 1982, over-the-counter medicines were sold in bottles you could open with a twist. After 1982, tamper-evident seals, foil coverings, and child-proof caps became standard. The crime reshaped consumer safety forever, but it also planted a seed of doubt that never fully went away. Even now, decades later, the case draws amateur sleuths and retired investigators back into its orbit. They pore over old police reports, analyze the timeline of the poisonings, and debate the killer's profile. Was it a disgruntled employee? A random sociopath? Someone seeking revenge on Johnson & Johnson? Theories abound, but the truth remains locked away, either in the mind of the killer or in evidence that has yet to be uncovered. The psychology of the victim's final moments is almost unbearable to imagine. They took a capsule for a headache, a cold, a minor ache, expecting relief. Within minutes, the cyanide would have begun its work, blocking the body's ability to use oxygen. Victims would have felt dizziness, confusion, then collapse. Death came quickly, but not instantly. And the killer knew this. They knew exactly what the poison would do, and they chose it anyway. The intrigue deepens when you consider the timing. The murders happened in rapid succession over just a few days. Then they stopped. No copycat wave, no second strike. It was as if the killer had achieved exactly what they wanted and then vanished. That abrupt end has fueled speculation for years. Was it a test, a message, or simply the satisfaction of watching a city unravel in fear? In the end, the Great Chicago Tylenol murders remain one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in American history. They are a reminder that the most dangerous threats are often the ones we can't see, the ones that hide in plain sight. They show how quickly trust can be weaponized, how fear can spread faster than any poison, and how a single act can change the way an entire society lives. Somewhere, someone knows the truth. Maybe they've carried it for decades, hidden behind an ordinary life. Maybe they've told no one, savoring the knowledge that they outwitted the world. Or maybe the truth is buried in a file box in some forgotten evidence room, waiting for the right eyes to see it. Until then, the Tylenol murders will remain what they have always been, a perfect storm of psychology, mystery, and intrigue. A crime with no clear motive, no proven suspect, and no closure. A story that begins with a bottle on a store shelf and ends with a question mark that has haunted Chicago for over 40 years. The Mount Vesuvius eruption destroying Pompeii. It began on an ordinary summer day in 79 AD. The markets bustled, the streets echoed with the sound of sandals on stone, and the shadow of Vesuvius loomed quietly over the Bay of Naples. The volcano had slept for centuries, its slopes green with vineyards, its presence so familiar that it was almost invisible to those who lived beneath it. But deep inside, pressure was building, an ancient clock counting down to a moment no one could see. When the first plume of ash rose into the sky, it might have seemed like a distant fire, but within hours, the sun was blotted out. Darkness fell at midday. The air thickened with choking dust, and then came the sound, like the tearing of the earth itself, followed by a rain of pumice stones that shattered rooftops and crushed anyone who lingered outside. Pompeii was trapped in a psychological nightmare. The human mind is wired to seek patterns, to compare the present to past experience. But nothing in living memory could explain what was happening. Some fled toward the sea, only to find the shoreline retreating as the water was pulled away by the force of the eruption. Others stayed inside, believing their walls could protect them. In moments of crisis, people cling to the familiar, even when the familiar is doomed. As the hours passed, the eruption shifted from ashfall to something far deadlier. Pyroclastic surges, clouds of superheated gas, and volcanic debris racing down the mountain at unimaginable speed. They moved like living things, silent until they were upon you, hotter than any fire, faster than any escape. In seconds, they could kill, leaving bodies frozen in their final moments. The psychology of those last hours is haunting. Archaeologists have found victims in positions that speak volumes. A man shielding a child, a woman clutching jewelry, a dog still chained in place. These are not just artifacts. They are snapshots of decision-making under extreme stress. Some tried to run, Some prayed, some simply waited. In the face of certain death, the mind narrows to instinct, and instinct is not always rational. When the ash finally settled, Pompeii was gone, buried under meters of volcanic debris. The city vanished from maps, its name fading into legend. For nearly 1,700 years, it lay hidden, perfectly preserved, as if the eruption had been a deliberate act of concealment. And here is where the intrigue begins. The rediscovery of Pompeii in the 18th century was not just an archaeological triumph. It was a revelation. Streets, frescoes, shops, even graffiti were intact. It was as if time had stopped mid-breath. But the first excavations were not driven purely by science. They were controlled by the Bourbon kings of Naples, who treated the site as a private treasure trove. Artifacts were removed in secret, sold to collectors, or hidden away in royal collections. Some frescoes, especially those depicting erotic scenes, were locked in secret cabinets, accessible only to select eyes. The official story was preservation. The unofficial motive was control. This selective unveiling shaped the world's perception of Pompeii. For decades, only certain parts of the city were shown, certain narratives told. The darker truths, the evidence of poverty, slavery, and political unrest, were downplayed in favor of a romanticized vision of a lost paradise. It was a kind of historical stagecraft, turning a real tragedy into a curated spectacle. Even today, there are unanswered questions. Some skeletons show signs of blunt force trauma, suggesting collapsing buildings. Others bear no visible injuries, their deaths likely caused by heat so intense it vaporized soft tissue instantly. But there are also anomalies, bodies found in positions that suggest they were moved after death, or clustered in ways that don't match the known sequence of events. Were these simply quirks of the eruption, or evidence of something more complex? Looting, perhaps, or attempts to hide valuables before fleeing? The psychology of the cover-up is as fascinating as the disaster itself. Those in power after the rediscovery understood that controlling the narrative meant controlling the legacy. By deciding which parts of Pompeii's story to reveal, they could shape how history remembered both the city and its destruction. And in doing so, they turned a natural disaster into a mirror, reflecting not just the past, but the ambitions and biases of those who unearthed it. There's also the deeper, more unsettling mystery. Why did so many stay? The eruption lasted for nearly 2 days. There were windows of escape, yet thousands perished. Was it disbelief? A lack of resources? Or something more human? The reluctance to abandon one's home, even when the walls are closing in. Psychologists call it normalcy bias, the tendency to underestimate the possibility of disaster because it has never happened before. In Pompeii, that bias was fatal. And so, the city became a paradox, destroyed in an instant, yet preserved for eternity. Its streets still echo with the lives that once filled them. Its walls still whisper the last thoughts of those who could not outrun the mountain. The ash that killed them also kept their world intact, sealing it away like a time capsule no one meant to make. Today, walking through Pompeii is like stepping into a dream frozen at the moment before waking. You see the baker's oven, the amphitheater, the painted walls of a wealthy merchant's home. You see the plaster casts of bodies, their faces twisted in expressions that defy words. And you realize that the real power of the story is not in the eruption itself, but in the way it forces us to confront the fragility of everything we build. The mountain still stands. Vesuvius has erupted many times since 79 AD, and it will erupt again. The people who live in its shadow know this, yet they stay, drawn by the same fertile soil, the same beauty, the same belief that disaster is something that happens to others. It is the same belief that kept Pompeii alive until the moment it wasn't. And perhaps that is the final, most haunting truth. The story of Pompeii is not just about the past. It is about us, our blindness to danger, our faith in permanence, and our tendency to bury the uncomfortable parts of history beneath a more palatable version. The ash may have hidden the city, but it also preserved the evidence of who we are and how little we change. The Great Fire of Rome under Nero. It began on the night of July 18th, 64 AD, in the tightly packed wooden shops near the Circus Maximus. A single spark in the summer heat, and the city became a furnace. Flames leapt from roof to roof, driven by a hot wind, devouring homes, temples, and markets. For 6 days, the fire raged without mercy. When it finally died down, 2/3 of Rome lay in ruins. But the destruction was only the beginning of the story. In the aftermath, whispers spread faster than the flames had. People claimed they had seen men, strangers, spreading the fire deliberately, throwing torches into buildings, blocking attempts to extinguish it. Some said these men were acting under orders. And in the heart of the rumor stood one name: Nero. The psychology of suspicion is simple. When disaster strikes, the mind searches for intent. Random tragedy is unbearable. It feels safer to believe someone caused it, because then it can be explained, even if the explanation is sinister. Nero was already a controversial figure, young, theatrical, and obsessed with his own image. He was known for his love of performance, for playing the lyre and reciting poetry. And so the most enduring image of the fire was born. Nero, watching the city burn, singing of Troy's destruction. Whether that image was truth or propaganda is still debated. Ancient sources disagree. Some say Nero was away in Antium when the fire began, returning only when it was already raging. Others insist he stood on a private stage, gazing at the inferno as if it were his own grand spectacle. The human mind, drawn to drama, clings to the latter. But why would an emperor burn his own capital? Here the intrigue deepens. After the fire, Nero announced an ambitious plan to rebuild Rome, not as it had been, but as he envisioned it. Wide streets, fireproof materials, and, at the center, his own magnificent palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It was a sprawling complex of marble halls, gardens, and artificial lakes, a monument to imperial ego. To some, it was proof of guilt. The fire had cleared the land he needed. Yet psychology warns us of the danger of hindsight bias. When we know the outcome, we assume the events leading to it were intentional. Nero's palace may have been opportunistic, but was it premeditated? Or was it simply the act of a ruler seizing advantage from chaos? The cover-up, or perhaps the deflection, came swiftly. Facing growing anger, Nero needed a scapegoat. He found one in a small, unpopular religious sect, the Christians. They were already viewed with suspicion, accused of strange rituals, and refusing to honor Rome's gods. Nero accused them of starting the fire, and the punishment was brutal. Christians were arrested, tortured, and executed in public spectacles, burned alive, torn apart by animals, crucified. This was more than vengeance. It was psychological warfare. By focusing the public's rage on an outsider group, Nero redirected suspicion away from himself. The spectacle of punishment served as both entertainment and warning. Dissent would be met with annihilation. But the tactic had a flaw. The sheer cruelty of the executions shocked even some of Nero's allies. Instead of erasing the whispers, it deepened them. The mind resists narratives that feel too convenient, and the choice of scapegoat seemed almost too perfect. The mystery of the Great Fire endures because it sits at the intersection of fact and perception. We know the fire happened. We know Nero rebuilt the city in his own image. We know he blamed the Christians. But the question of intent, whether he lit the match or merely exploited the flames, remains unanswered. From a psychological perspective, Nero's story is a study in image control. He understood the power of spectacle, both in art and in politics. He staged performances to charm the masses, yet those same instincts may have betrayed him. In times of crisis, people look for leaders who act decisively, not theatrically. If Nero did not start the fire, his failure was in how he appeared to respond to it. Too much like a performer, not enough like a savior. There is also the deeper human tendency to mythologize disaster. The burning of Rome became more than a historical event. It became a symbol. For centuries, it has been retold as a cautionary tale about vanity, power, and the fragility of civilization. The image of an emperor watching his city burn is irresistible because it speaks to a fear that power can be both destructive and indifferent. And perhaps that is why the truth may never matter as much as the story. The fire's origin is lost to time, but its legacy is alive in the way we remember it. Every retelling shapes Nero's image: tyrant, artist, arsonist, or victim of slander. The ambiguity is the hook. It keeps the mind circling back, searching for certainty in a place where certainty no longer exists. In the end, the Great Fire of Rome is less about the flames that consumed the city and more about the firestorm of perception that followed. It is about how leaders are judged not only by their actions, but by the stories told about them. It is about how a single event can be transformed into legend, weaponized for political survival or destruction. And it is about the unsettling truth that history is not a fixed record. It is a shifting narrative, shaped by those who tell it, and by those who choose what to believe. The ruins of the Domus Aurea still lie beneath modern Rome, a buried reminder of the man who built it in the fire's wake. Whether it was born from ambition or opportunism, it stands as a monument to the enduring mystery of that night in 64 AD, when the city burned and the line between disaster and design blurred into smoke. The mysterious Mary Celeste ship. On December 5, 1872, a British brigantine named Dei Grazia spotted another vessel drifting aimlessly in the choppy waters of the Atlantic. Its sails were partially set, its hull intact, and it moved with the wind as if guided by an invisible hand. That ship was the Mary Celeste. When the crew of the Dei Grazia boarded her, they found no one, not a single soul. The ship was seaworthy. The cargo, over 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, was untouched. The crew's belongings were still in their quarters, clothes neatly folded, pipes and tobacco left behind, even a sewing machine mid-project. The galley was stocked with food. The lifeboat was gone, and yet there were no signs of struggle, no blood, no damage that could explain why the crew had abandoned her. From that moment, the Mary Celeste became one of the most enduring maritime mysteries in history. Psychologists who study human behavior at sea know that abandoning a perfectly functional ship is almost unthinkable. At sea, your vessel is your lifeline. To leave it without clear cause suggests either overwhelming fear or a catastrophic misjudgment. Fear can override logic, and in the isolation of the open ocean, the mind can magnify threats until they feel inescapable. The captain, Benjamin Briggs, was an experienced sailor. His wife and 2-year-old daughter were aboard, along with a crew of 7. Briggs was known for his discipline and caution, hardly the type to make a rash decision. So what could have driven him to order everyone into a lifeboat, never to be seen again? The theories began immediately. Some claimed pirates had attacked, but nothing was stolen. Others suggested mutiny, but there was no evidence of violence. A sudden waterspout? A seaquake? Poisonous fumes from the alcohol cargo? Each idea seemed plausible until examined closely, and then it unraveled. The psychology of mystery thrives on gaps, places where facts end and imagination begins. The Mary Celeste offered nothing but gaps. No log entries explained the abandonment. The last note in the ship's log was calm, routine, and gave no hint of danger. This absence of explanation is what makes the case so haunting. The human brain is wired to seek closure, but here, closure is denied. Some maritime historians point to the ship's condition when found. The sails were ragged, and there was a disassembled pump on deck, suggesting the crew might have believed the ship was taking on water. But the bilge contained only a small amount, hardly enough to justify evacuation. Could it be that Briggs misread the situation, fearing the alcohol fumes might ignite, and ordered everyone into the lifeboat as a precaution? If so, the decision was fatal. A lifeboat in the open Atlantic is a fragile thing, easily lost to wind and wave. Yet there's another layer, one that edges into the territory of cover-up. The salvage hearing that followed the discovery of the Mary Celeste was unusually intense. The court seemed determined to find wrongdoing, questioning the Dei Grazia's crew as if they might have staged the whole thing. The salvage award was suspiciously low, as if the authorities suspected foul play but couldn't prove it. This official unease only deepened public fascination. In the absence of answers, the story became a canvas for the imagination. Some claimed the crew had fallen victim to sea monsters or ghostly apparitions. Others whispered about secret insurance fraud schemes or clandestine smuggling operations gone wrong. The more outlandish the theory, the more it seemed to fit, because the truth was unknowable. From a psychological standpoint, the Mary Celeste is a perfect storm of intrigue. It combines the primal fear of the sea with the unsettling image of a place abandoned in midlife. There's something deeply disturbing about walking into a room or boarding a ship where everything is in order, but the people are gone. It suggests an interruption so sudden, so absolute, that it leaves no trace. The mind struggles with that kind of void. We expect chaos to leave evidence. Broken furniture, scattered belongings, signs of struggle. But here, the stillness is the evidence. It's the silence that screams. Even the ship's later history adds to the unease. After being salvaged, the Mary Celeste returned to service, but she never shook her reputation. Sailors considered her cursed. She changed hands multiple times, each owner meeting misfortune. Eventually, she was deliberately wrecked in an insurance scam, an ignoble end for a vessel that had once carried one of the sea's greatest mysteries. And yet, the mystery didn't die with her. It lives on because it taps into something universal, the fear of vanishing without explanation. In the modern world, with satellites and instant communication, we like to think such disappearances are impossible. But the Mary Celeste reminds us that the ocean is vast, indifferent, and capable of swallowing both people and their stories whole. There's also the unsettling thought that the truth might have been simple, an error in judgment, a sudden squall, a rope snapping at the wrong moment. But that simplicity was lost forever in the waves. Sometimes the most haunting mysteries aren't the ones with elaborate conspiracies, but the ones where the answer is just out of reach, tantalizingly close, yet forever hidden. The Mary Celeste drifts through history like she drifted through the Atlantic that day, silent, intact, and empty. She is a reminder that not all stories end neatly, that some remain open wounds in the fabric of our understanding. And perhaps that's why we can't let her go. Because in the end, the Mary Celeste isn't just a ship. She's a question that has sailed for over a century without an answer, carried on the tides of human curiosity into the endless horizon where fact and imagination meet. The world's fair serial killer hotel of H.H. Holmes. In 1893, Chicago was alive with light, music, and the promise of the future. The world's Columbian Exposition had transformed the city into a glittering stage for innovation and wonder. But just a few blocks away from the fairgrounds, another kind of stage was set, one built not for celebration, but for death. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H.H. Holmes, was a man of charm and calculation. On the surface, he was a successful businessman, a doctor, and a hotel owner. But beneath that polished exterior was a mind that blended meticulous planning with a chilling absence of empathy. Psychologists today would call it psychopathy, an ability to mimic human warmth while feeling nothing. Holmes didn't just kill, he engineered an environment for killing. His three-story building became known as the Murder Castle. From the outside, it looked like any other hotel. Inside, it was a labyrinth of deception. Hallways ended abruptly at brick walls. Staircases led nowhere. Doors opened to sheer drops. Some rooms were soundproofed, others airtight. There were hidden chutes that sent bodies directly to the basement, where Holmes kept vats of acid, quicklime, and a furnace large enough to erase evidence. The psychology of such a place is as disturbing as its architecture. Holmes understood that fear isn't just about what you see, it's about what you can't see. Guests would check in, unaware that the very walls around them were part of a design meant to disorient, trap, and ultimately destroy them. In a way, the building itself became an accomplice, a silent predator. Holmes' timing was perfect for his purposes. The World's Fair drew millions of visitors from across the globe, people who could disappear without raising suspicion. In the chaos of the city's booming population, missing persons were just another statistic. Holmes exploited this anonymity, offering lodging to travelers, young women seeking work, and fairgoers looking for a place to stay. Many were never seen again. The intrigue deepens when you consider how Holmes managed to keep his activities hidden in plain sight. He hired and fired construction crews constantly, ensuring no single worker understood the full layout of the building. He paid bills late, changed suppliers, and used false names. This constant churn created confusion, making it nearly impossible for anyone to piece together what he was building. There's a psychological principle at play here: compartmentalization. Holmes didn't just compartmentalize his building, he compartmentalized his life. To some, he was a charming landlord. To others, a respectable doctor. And to his victims, he was a savior offering opportunity. Each role was a mask, and he wore them flawlessly. When the truth began to surface, it wasn't through a dramatic confession or a single slip-up. It was through a slow unraveling, financial fraud, suspicious disappearances, and the testimony of those who had narrowly escaped his grasp. Even then, the full scope of his crimes was difficult to prove. Holmes was a master manipulator, skilled at twisting facts and exploiting the gaps in the legal system of the time. The cover-up wasn't just Holmes' doing, it was also a product of the era. The police lacked the forensic tools we take for granted today. There were no centralized databases, no DNA testing, no instant communication between jurisdictions. Holmes moved through these cracks like water, adapting to every obstacle. And yet, the most unsettling mystery remains. How many victims were there? Estimates range from 9 to over 200. Holmes himself gave conflicting accounts, sometimes boasting of dozens of murders, other times downplaying his guilt. Psychologists suggest this inconsistency was deliberate, a way to maintain control over the narrative, to keep the truth forever out of reach. The human mind craves closure. We want to know the exact number, the precise details, the definitive truth. Holmes denied us that. By leaving the story incomplete, he ensured his legend would grow. This is the same psychological hook that keeps unsolved mysteries alive for decades. The unanswered question becomes more powerful than the answer itself. Even after his arrest, Holmes maintained an eerie composure. In interviews, he spoke of his crimes with detachment, as if describing someone else's life. He once claimed he was born with the devil inside him. Whether this was an honest admission or another layer of manipulation is impossible to say, but it reveals a mind that understood the power of myth-making. The murder castle itself was eventually destroyed, but its blueprint lives on in the public imagination. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with violence or chaos. Sometimes it hides behind charm, behind opportunity, behind the promise of safety. Holmes' genius, if it can be called that, was in making his victims feel secure until it was too late. There's a chilling parallel between the fair and the hotel. The World's Fair was a celebration of human achievement, a showcase of progress and possibility. Holmes' hotel was the inverse, a monument to human darkness, built with the same ingenuity but driven by a different purpose. Both were products of the same city, the same moment in history. One drew people in with light, the other swallowed them in shadow. In the end, Holmes was hanged for his crimes. But death didn't erase the questions. How many lives did he take? How many families never knew what happened to their loved ones? And how many other predators have learned from his methods, hiding in plain sight, using trust as a weapon? The psychology of H. Holmes is a study in contrasts, intelligence without empathy, charm without conscience, ambition without morality. He understood that the most effective traps are the ones people walk into willingly. And he built his life and his hotel around that truth. The fairgrounds are long gone now, replaced by new streets and new buildings. But somewhere in the static of history, the echo of that place remains, a maze of locked doors, silent hallways, and the quiet certainty that someone, somewhere, was listening to your last breath. And perhaps that's the final, most enduring mystery. Not the number of victims, not the exact layout of the murder castle, but the unsettling realization that the mind capable of creating it once walked among us, smiling, shaking hands, and asking if you'd like a room for the night. The Cold War numbers stations mystery. A voice, flat and mechanical, drifts through the static. 74917. It repeats, unblinking, as if the airwaves themselves have been hypnotized. No music, no explanation, just numbers. And somewhere, someone is listening, someone who understands exactly what they mean. During the Cold War, the world was a chessboard of paranoia. Every move was calculated, every silence suspicious. But hidden beneath the roar of propaganda and the thunder of nuclear threats was a quieter war, one fought in whispers, in coded messages, in the invisible corridors of shortwave radio. Number stations. They appeared without warning, broadcasting from nowhere to nowhere. A monotone voice, sometimes male, sometimes female, sometimes a child, reading endless strings of numbers, letters, or strange phonetic words. To the untrained ear, it was nonsense. To the right person, it was an order. Psychologists who've studied the phenomenon say the eeriest part isn't the sound, it's the intent. Humans are wired to search for patterns, to make sense of chaos. But number stations deny you that satisfaction. They give you just enough to know there's meaning, and then lock you out. That's the hook. That's the torment. It's the same psychological tension that makes an unsolved crime so haunting. The knowledge that the answer exists, but it's not for you. Governments never admitted to running them. In fact, official silence was part of the game. When journalists asked about the broadcasts, agencies shrugged. No comment. And yet, the signals kept coming. Some were wrapped in eerie melodies, like the infamous Lincolnshire Poacher, which began with a cheery English folk tune before the numbers began. Others used distorted tones, mechanical beeps, or even snippets of Morse code. It was as if the stations wanted to be found, but not understood. The psychology of secrecy is powerful. When you know someone is hiding something, your mind becomes obsessed with uncovering it. This is why conspiracy theories thrive, not because people are irrational, but because the human brain is addicted to closure. Number stations weaponized that instinct. They didn't just hide the truth, they flaunted it. The most chilling part? These broadcasts weren't relics of the past. They didn't vanish when the Berlin Wall fell. They're still out there, whispering through the static, their transmitters hidden in deserts, forests, or behind embassy walls. Some have changed voices, some have changed frequencies, but they never stop. There's a psychological term, the uncanny, for when something is almost familiar, but not quite right. A doll's face that's too lifelike. A voice that sounds human, but isn't. Number stations live in that uncanny valley. They sound like they should make sense, but they don't. And that gap between expectation and reality creates unease that lingers long after you've turned the dial. Then there's the question of the listener. Imagine you're a deep cover agent in a foreign city. You can't risk phone calls, emails, or even letters. But you own a cheap shortwave radio. You tune in at exactly 2100 hours. A voice reads your code. You write it down, decode it with your one-time pad, and burn the paper. No one can trace it. No one can prove it. It's the perfect crime of communication. But perfection breeds paranoia. What if you miss a broadcast? What if the voice changes? What if the numbers stop entirely? Psychologists studying espionage note that agents often develop hypervigilance, an obsessive scanning of their environment for threats. Number stations could feed that state of mind, turning every broadcast into a lifeline or a death sentence. And then there are the accidents. In 1997, a Cuban number station was caught mid-broadcast when the wrong switch was flipped. Instead of numbers, the station aired the voices of Cuban intelligence officers giving instructions to an undercover agent in Washington, D.C. The FBI recorded it. The agent was arrested. It was a rare crack in the wall of secrecy, a reminder that behind the cold, mechanical voice was a human hand. But most of the time, the wall holds. And that's where the mystery deepens. Some stations have been broadcasting for decades without a single confirmed origin. No one knows who runs them, who listens, or what the messages say. And maybe that's the point. In psychology, there's a concept called the Zeigarnik effect, the tendency to remember unfinished tasks better than completed ones. Number stations are the ultimate unfinished task. They start a story in your mind, but never end it. They leave you suspended in a state of permanent curiosity. And curiosity, when it can't be satisfied, becomes obsession. There are hobbyists, ordinary people, who spend their nights scanning the airwaves, recording every broadcast, cataloging every voice. They give the stations nicknames: the Swedish Rhapsody, the Gong Station, Cherry Ripe. They build archives, compare notes, and chase patterns that may not even exist. It's a strange kind of devotion, half detective work, half ghost hunting. Because in a way, number stations are ghosts. They haunt the air, invisible but undeniable. They carry the weight of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. And like all good ghosts, they refuse to explain themselves. The cover-up is almost elegant. No denials, no admissions, just the endless hum of transmitters in the night. If you ask too many questions, you're met with silence. And silence, in the world of espionage, is its own kind of answer. Some believe the stations are decoys now, psychological warfare meant to unsettle foreign intelligence agencies, to make them waste resources chasing shadows. Others think they're still active, still delivering real orders to real agents. The truth could be either, or both, or neither. And that's the genius of it. The mystery isn't just in the message, it's in the fact that you'll never know if the message was meant for you. So the next time you find yourself awake at 3 a.m., turn the dial on an old shortwave radio. Listen to the static. Wait for the voice. When it comes, it will be calm, unhurried. It will speak as if the world isn't listening, because it isn't speaking to the world. It's speaking to one person. And for a moment, you'll wonder if that person is you. The Great Depression's darkest days. A time when the world's most powerful economies collapsed like houses of cards, and the very idea of stability became a memory. From 1929 through the early 1930s, the streets of America, Europe, and beyond were filled not with the hum of industry, but with the silence of shuttered factories, empty pockets, and dreams put on hold. But beneath the breadlines and the dust-choked farms lay a deeper story, one of human psychology under siege, of mysteries that still linger, and of truths that were carefully managed, if not buried entirely. The stock market crash of October 1929 is often painted as the spark that lit the fire. In reality, it was the first visible crack in a structure already weakened by speculation, debt, and a fragile banking system. In the years leading up to the crash, optimism had become a kind of national currency. Psychologists call it irrational exuberance, the belief that the good times will never end. That risk is an illusion. When that illusion shattered, it wasn't just wealth that vanished, it was trust. Banks failed by the thousands. People who had spent their lives saving saw their money evaporate overnight. The human mind, faced with such sudden loss, searches for someone to blame. Some pointed to corrupt financiers, others to government mismanagement, and still others to shadowy forces manipulating the economy for their own gain. The truth was complex, but complexity doesn't comfort the hungry. And so, simple villains and simple stories began to take hold. The mystery of the Great Depression lies partly in its depth. Why did it last so long? Why did recovery come in fits and starts, even as governments poured resources into relief? Some historians argue that the crisis was prolonged by deliberate choices, policies designed to protect certain industries or financial institutions at the expense of ordinary people. If that's true, then the Depression wasn't just an economic disaster. It was also a redistribution of power, hidden beneath the language of necessity. The cover-up, if it can be called that, was not about denying the Depression's existence. No one could ignore the breadlines or the Hoovervilles. It was about controlling the narrative. Official statements emphasized resilience, downplayed unrest, and framed suffering as a temporary hardship on the road to a brighter future. Photographs of stoic families and hardworking men were circulated to inspire hope, but rarely did those images show the desperation, the quiet breakdowns, the suicides that rose sharply in those years. From a psychological perspective, this was a calculated move. Hope is a survival tool. If people believe recovery is just around the corner, they are less likely to revolt, less likely to abandon the system entirely. But hope, when stretched too far, can become a form of control, keeping people in place while the real levers of power are pulled behind closed doors. The darkest days were not just about hunger or poverty, they were about the erosion of identity. For many, work was more than a paycheck, it was a source of dignity. When jobs vanished, so did that sense of self-worth. Men who had been providers found themselves standing in relief lines. Women took on whatever work they could find, often for pennies, while also holding families together. Children grew up fast, learning the language of scarcity before they learned their multiplication tables. And yet, even in the depths of the Depression, there were those who thrived. Industries tied to government contracts, certain banks, and well-positioned investors managed not only to survive, but to expand their influence. This fueled whispers of conspiracy, that the crisis had been exploited, if not engineered, to consolidate wealth and control. Whether or not those whispers were true, they reveal something about the human mind. In times of chaos, we look for patterns, for hidden hands guiding events, because randomness is harder to accept than manipulation. The intrigue deepens when you consider the global dimension. The Depression was not confined to America. It rippled across the world, toppling governments, fueling extremist movements, and setting the stage for the next great conflict. In some countries, the crisis was used as a pretext to seize power, to suspend freedoms, to reshape societies in ways that would have been unthinkable in times of prosperity. Economic collapse became a political weapon. In the United States, public works programs and reforms eventually began to restore some stability. But even these were not free from controversy. Some saw them as salvation, others saw them as overreach. And behind the scenes, deals were struck, alliances formed, and compromises made that would shape the nation's economic landscape for decades. Not all of those decisions were made in the open. The psychology of the Great Depression's darkest days is a study in contrasts. On one hand, it revealed the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to adapt, to endure, to find moments of joy in the bleakest circumstances. On the other, it exposed how fragile that spirit can be when trust is broken, when the systems meant to protect us seem to serve only themselves. By the late 1930s, the Depression was easing, but it never truly ended in the way people hoped. It was the mobilization for war that finally pulled economies back to full strength. And that, too, raises questions. If war could end the Depression, could other choices have done the same without the cost in lives? Or was the world so locked into its patterns of power that only a global conflict could reset the game? Today, the Great Depression is remembered in black and white photographs, in the faces of men riding freight trains, in the dust storms that swallowed farms whole. But its deeper legacy is in the way it reshaped our understanding of security, trust, and truth. It showed that the line between stability and collapse is thinner than we like to believe, and that in the aftermath of collapse, the story we are told may not be the whole story. The Great Depression's darkest days were not just an economic chapter. They were a psychological crucible, a mystery of motives and mistakes, and a reminder that the most enduring scars are often the ones we cannot see. And perhaps the greatest intrigue of all is this, that even now, nearly a century later, we are still piecing together what really happened and who, in the shadows, may have shaped it. The Salem witch trials, a chapter in history where fear became law and suspicion became a death sentence. In the winter of 1692, in the small Puritan settlement of Salem Village, the human mind was about to become both weapon and victim. It began with whispers, strange fits, contorted bodies, voices claiming to hear things no one else could. And in a society where the devil was not a metaphor but a living enemy, those whispers were enough to ignite a fire that would consume the innocent. Psychology tells us that fear is contagious. It spreads faster than reason, bypassing logic, embedding itself deep in the primitive parts of the brain. In Salem, fear didn't just spread, it metastasized. A few unexplained illnesses became evidence of witchcraft. A handful of accusations became a flood. And once the first names were spoken aloud, the mind of the community shifted. It was no longer about truth, it was about survival. The accused were often outsiders, those who didn't conform, who spoke too boldly, who owned land others coveted. But here's the darker truth. In Salem, guilt was not proven by evidence. It was proven by the absence of a defense. If you denied the charge, you were lying. If you confessed, you were guilty. Either way, the verdict was the same. This is the psychology of a closed system, where belief is self-reinforcing and contradiction is impossible. Once the idea of witches took hold, every action, every word, every glance could be reinterpreted as proof. And when the mind is primed to see evil, it will find it, even where none exists. But beneath the hysteria, there were other forces at work. Land disputes, family rivalries, political maneuvering. The trials became a perfect cover for settling old scores. Accusation was a weapon, and the courtroom was the battlefield. In this way, the witch trials were not just a mass delusion. They were a calculated purge, hidden beneath the cloak of righteousness. The cover-up was subtle, but it was there. The official records speak of justice, of protecting the community from Satan's influence. But what they don't say is how many of the accusers benefited from the downfall of their neighbors. Property changed hands, influence shifted, and when the trials ended, those gains remained. The dead were gone, but the living had reshaped Salem to their advantage. From a psychological perspective, the most chilling part is how ordinary people became executioners. The judges, the ministers, the neighbors, they believed they were doing God's work. This is the danger of moral certainty. When you are convinced you are right, you will justify any act, no matter how cruel. And when the entire community shares that certainty, dissent becomes impossible. The trials also reveal the power of suggestion. The afflicted girls, those who claimed to see spirits, were the center of attention in a society where young women were expected to be silent. Their visions, whether real, imagined, or performed, gave them unprecedented influence. And the more they were believed, the more elaborate their accusations became. It's a feedback loop. Attention fuels performance, performance fuels belief, and belief fuels more attention. But what if some of those visions weren't entirely imagined? What if environmental factors, contaminated food, illness, or even mass psychogenic illness, played a role? Science has suggested possibilities, but the truth is, we will never know for certain. And perhaps that uncertainty is part of the reason the Salem witch trials still haunt us. Because this isn't just a story about the past. It's a mirror. It shows us how quickly reason can collapse under the weight of fear, how easily justice can be twisted into vengeance, and how the mind, once convinced of a narrative, will ignore any evidence that threatens it. The aftermath was quiet. The executions stopped. The accusations faded. And slowly, the same leaders who had fanned the flames began to distance themselves from the fire. Some offered apologies. Others rewrote their roles in the story. The official narrative shifted from righteous defense to tragic mistake. But the damage was done. 19 people hanged, 1 crushed to death, dozens imprisoned, and an entire community left with the stain of its own actions. The cover-up was not in hiding the trials. It was in reframing them, turning them into a cautionary tale, a moral lesson, rather than an admission of calculated cruelty. It's easier to say we were misled than to admit we chose to destroy. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding two conflicting truths. To ease that discomfort, we rewrite the past. We soften our guilt. We tell ourselves we were victims of the time, of ignorance, of hysteria. And in doing so, we protect ourselves from the unbearable truth that we are capable of the same thing, even now. That is the real intrigue of Salem. Not the question of whether witches existed, but the question of how quickly we can create them. How easily we can turn neighbor against neighbor. How fear, once unleashed, can be shaped into a weapon by those who know how to use it. The Salem witch trials are over. The gallows are gone. The names of the accused are carved into memorials instead of death warrants. But the psychology that made it possible, the fear, the certainty, the hunger for control, still lives in us. It waits for the right conditions. A spark, a whisper, a story we want to believe. And when that moment comes, the lesson of Salem is not that we are safer now. It's that we are not. Because the greatest cover-up is not in hiding the truth. It's in convincing ourselves that we would never be the ones holding the rope. The lost colony of Roanoke. A name whispered through the centuries like a ghost that refuses to rest. In 1587, over 100 settlers vanished from Roanoke Island, leaving behind only a single word carved into a weathered post: Croton. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just silence and questions that have never been answered. But this isn't just a story about a missing colony. It's a story about the human mind, how fear shapes memory, how secrecy manipulates truth, and how the unknown can be more dangerous than any enemy we can see. Imagine the psychology of those final days. A small, isolated group, cut off from England, supplies dwindling, the wilderness pressing in. Every sound in the night becomes a threat, every shadow a warning. In such conditions, the mind begins to fracture. Paranoia spreads faster than hunger. And when fear takes root, it doesn't just change what you think, it changes what you believe. The official records tell us that Governor John White left the colony to return to England for supplies. But when he came back 3 years later, the settlement was deserted. No signs of violence, no graves. Only that single word, Croton, etched deep into the wood, as if it were meant to be found. But here's the question: was it a clue or a warning? Psychologists know that in moments of extreme stress, humans cling to symbols. A single word can become a lifeline, a code, a way to pass on meaning when speech is impossible. But symbols are also dangerous. They can be manipulated, planted, or misunderstood. What if Ceroitian wasn't left by the colonists at all? What if it was left for the rescuers to lead them away from the truth? The mystery deepens when you consider the political climate of the time. England and Spain were locked in a bitter rivalry. Colonies weren't just settlements. They were chess pieces in a global game of power. If Roanoke failed, it wasn't just a tragedy, it was a humiliation. And humiliation is something governments have always been skilled at burying. Cover-ups don't always require lies. Sometimes, all it takes is silence. Erase a few records. Let the story fade. Allow the mystery to become folklore, and the truth is buried under centuries of speculation. But the human mind hates loose ends. We are wired to seek closure, to fill in the blanks. And when facts are missing, we create our own. That's why the Roanoke mystery has spawned theories ranging from assimilation with local tribes, to mass starvation, to supernatural intervention. Each theory says more about the people who believe it than about the colony itself. Consider the assimilation theory. It paints the colonists as adaptable, willing to merge with the Croton people to survive. It's a hopeful narrative, one that appeals to those who believe in cooperation over conflict. But then there's the darker theory, that the colonists were wiped out, either by hostile forces or by their own descent into chaos. This theory resonates with those who see human nature as fragile, easily corrupted under pressure. And then there's the most unsettling possibility of all, that the colonists didn't vanish in a single event, but slowly, quietly, over time. One by one, slipping away into the forest, into the sea, into the unknown. No massacre, no grand finale, just a slow erosion of hope until nothing remained. From a psychological perspective, this is perhaps the most haunting scenario, because it mirrors the way people disappear in our own lives, not in a blaze of drama, but in the quiet drift of distance, until one day we realize they're gone. But what if the disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, but a choice? What if the colonists decided that the life they had been promised, a New England across the sea, was a lie? What if they chose to abandon it, to walk away from the empire that had sent them there? Such an act would have been unthinkable at the time, and perhaps that's why it was never recorded. The mind recoils from truths that threaten its foundation. When reality doesn't match the story we've built, we either change the story or bury it. And buried truths have a way of rotting into legend. Even today, the word Croton carries an almost hypnotic weight. It has appeared in literature, in television, in whispered campfire tales. It's become a symbol of the unsolved, the unknowable. And that's the real power of the Roanoke mystery. It's not just about what happened. It's about what didn't happen. No confession, no discovery, no final chapter. In psychology, there's a phenomenon called the Zygarnik effect, our tendency to remember unfinished stories more vividly than completed ones. The lost colony is the ultimate unfinished story, and so it lingers, not because of what we know, but because of what we never will. Perhaps that's why, centuries later, we still search for answers. Not because we expect to find them, but because the search itself gives us meaning. The mystery becomes a mirror, reflecting our own fears, our own need for control in a world that offers none. And maybe that's the final twist in the Roanoke story, that the colony was never truly lost. It lives on, in our minds, in our need to explain the unexplainable, in the way we pass the word Croton from one generation to the next like a secret we don't fully understand. Because in the end, the greatest cover-up isn't hiding the truth. It's convincing the world that the truth doesn't matter, and perhaps that never did. The Black Death sweeping Europe, a shadow that moved faster than armies, striking without warning, leaving silence in its wake. In the mid-14th century, it arrived like a whisper from the east, first a rumor, then a trickle of deaths, and then a flood. Within just a few years, it would erase nearly half the population of Europe. But this is not just a story of disease. It is a story of the human mind under siege, of fear, manipulation, and the secrets buried beneath the plague's black shroud. Imagine the psychology of those first outbreaks. A village hears of a sickness in the next town. People begin to cough, to weaken, to die within days. No one understands why. In a world without germ theory, the mind searches for meaning in the only places it knows: sin, punishment, the supernatural. And when the cause is invisible, the imagination becomes the most dangerous weapon of all. Fear rewires the brain. It narrows focus, heightens suspicion, and makes the improbable seem inevitable. Neighbors begin to watch each other. Strangers are turned away at the gates. And when fear reaches its peak, the mind demands an enemy. In the chaos of the Black Death, that enemy became anyone who was different: foreigners, the poor, the sick, even entire religious communities. Accusations spread faster than the plague itself. But here's where the mystery deepens. The official chronicles speak of rats and fleas, of ships carrying death into crowded ports. Yet there are gaps, strange silences in the records, outbreaks in places where no trade routes reached, deaths that followed patterns too precise to be random. Some historians whisper of deliberate quarantines that were never meant to save lives, but to protect the powerful. Entire districts sealed off, not because they were infected, but because they were politically inconvenient. The cover-up was not in hiding the plague. It was in controlling the narrative. If the people believed the sickness was divine punishment, they would not question the failures of their rulers. If they believed it was caused by outsiders, they would turn their rage away from the throne and toward each other. And so, the story of the Black Death became a weapon, shaped, sharpened, and aimed by those who stood to gain from the chaos. Psychologically, the plague created a perfect storm for manipulation. When death feels inevitable, the mind becomes desperate for control. People clung to rituals, charms, and superstitions, not because they worked, but because they gave the illusion of safety. And those illusions could be sold by priests, by merchants, by anyone who claimed to have the cure. In the shadows of the dying, fortunes were made. But there is another layer to this mystery, one that still unsettles scholars. In some regions, mortality rates were far lower than in others, even when the conditions seemed identical. Why? Was it luck, immunity, or something more deliberate? There are whispers of towns that closed their gates early, not just to keep the plague out, but to keep their secrets in. Records vanish. Burial sites are hidden. And when the plague finally passes, those towns emerge stronger, richer, and more powerful than before. The human mind is drawn to patterns, and in the aftermath of the Black Death, the patterns are hard to ignore. Certain families rose to prominence. Certain trade routes shifted. And certain voices, those who had spoken too loudly against authority, were simply gone. It is as if the plague did not just kill at random, but cleared the board for a new game entirely. From a psychological standpoint, the most haunting truth is how quickly people adapted to the horror. At first, the sight of a cart piled with bodies was unthinkable. Months later, it was routine. The mind, in its need to survive, normalizes even the most grotesque realities. And once something becomes normal, it can be used. The constant presence of death made people more willing to accept extreme measures: curfews, confiscations, forced relocations. Measures that, once in place, did not vanish when the plague did. The Black Death also left a scar on the collective psyche. Generations grew up in its shadow, inheriting not just the trauma, but the stories shaped by those who had controlled the narrative from the start. And in those stories, the truth was buried beneath layers of fear, faith, and fabrication. Even now, centuries later, the mystery endures. We know the plague was real. We know it killed millions. But the details, the decisions made in locked rooms, the orders given in whispers, remain hidden. Perhaps they always will. Because the greatest cover-ups are not the ones that erase the truth. They are the ones that replace it with a story so compelling, so terrifying, that no one dares to question it. And maybe that is why the Black Death still fascinates us. It is not just the scale of the tragedy, but the way it reveals the machinery of fear. How quickly the mind can be turned against itself. How easily a crisis can be shaped into an opportunity for those who know how to wield it. The plague ended. The cities rebuilt. Life returned. But the psychology it awakened, the fear of the unseen, the hunger for control, the willingness to believe the story we are told, never truly died. It waits, patient, for the next shadow to fall. Because in the end, the Black Death was more than a disease. It was a mirror, and what it showed us was not just the fragility of the body, but the fragility of the mind. The mysterious dancing plague of 1518. A summer morning in Strasbourg, a woman steps into the street and begins to dance. Not with joy, not with music, but with a strange, fevered compulsion, her feet pounding the cobblestones as if driven by something unseen. Hours pass, then days. She cannot stop. And soon, others join her. Dozens, then hundreds. Men, women, even children, all moving in a trance-like state, their bodies jerking and spinning until they collapse from exhaustion, only to rise and begin again. History records it as an outbreak of dancing mania, but the truth is far stranger. Because no one, not then, not now, can say for certain what caused it. And when the mind cannot explain, it begins to invent. From a psychological perspective, the dancing plague is a perfect storm of human vulnerability. Strasbourg in 1518 was a city under pressure. Famine, disease, and crushing poverty had left its people desperate. In such conditions, the brain becomes fertile ground for mass hysteria. Fear, stress, and suggestion can spread through a community like wildfire, bypassing reason and embedding themselves deep in the subconscious. One person's breakdown becomes another's trigger, and soon, the line between choice and compulsion disappears. But there's something unsettling about the way the authorities responded. Instead of stopping the dancers, they encouraged them. Musicians were hired. A stage was built. The city claimed it was to dance the sickness out. But what if that was only the story they told? What if the real reason was far more calculated? The early 16th century was a time of deep religious and political tension. The church's grip on the people was strong, but cracks were beginning to show. A public spectacle, hundreds of citizens writhing in the streets, could be used as a warning, a demonstration of divine punishment for sin. And fear, once planted, is the most effective form of control. There are whispers in the historical record, gaps where details should be. No clear account of how the plague ended. No explanation for why certain people were affected while others were not. And no mention of what happened to the dancers afterward. Were they cured? Were they silenced? Or were they simply erased from the story? Psychologists know that memory is malleable. When an event is traumatic, the mind reshapes it, smoothing the edges, removing the parts that don't fit the narrative. And when those in power control the narrative, the truth can vanish entirely. The dancing plague may not have been a mystery to those who lived through it, only to those of us who inherited the version they wanted us to see. Some theories point to ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic mold that grows on rye. It can cause convulsions, visions, and a sense of uncontrollable movement. But ergot doesn't explain the coordination, the way the dancers seem to feed off each other's energy, as if caught in a shared trance. Nor does it explain why the outbreak stopped as suddenly as it began. Others suggest it was a form of mass psychogenic illness, where symptoms spread through observation and belief rather than infection. In a city already primed by fear and superstition, the sight of one person dancing uncontrollably could have triggered the same behavior in others. But even this leaves questions. Why did it last for weeks? Why did so many dance themselves to death without breaking free from the compulsion? The most unsettling possibility is that it was neither accident nor illness. That the event was orchestrated, engineered to distract, to terrify, or to remove certain individuals from the city without open violence. A public plague is the perfect cover for a quiet purge. No one questions the dead when they die of a curse. From a psychological standpoint, the dancing plague reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. We like to believe our actions are our own, that our thoughts are private, our movements voluntary. But under the right conditions, stress, fear, suggestion, our minds can be hijacked. We can be made to act against our will, even to our own destruction, without ever realizing we've lost control. And perhaps that is why the story still haunts us. Because it's not just about a strange event in a distant century. It's about the fragility of the mind. The way reality can bend when enough people believe the same thing. The way a single spark, one woman stepping into the street, can ignite an entire city. The records say the dancing stopped after the afflicted were taken to a shrine, prayed over, and removed from the public eye. But that ending feels too neat, too convenient. What if the shrine was not a place of healing, but a place of containment? What if the dancers who survived were hidden away, their condition studied, their existence erased so the truth could never spread? The mystery of 1518 is not just why they danced. It's why we stopped asking. Why the details faded into folklore. Why the official story remains so thin, so unsatisfying. Because the greatest cover-up is not in hiding the facts. It's in convincing the world that the facts don't matter. And maybe that's the real legacy of the dancing plague. Not the image of bodies twisting in the summer heat, but the reminder that the mind is not as unshakable as we think. That under the right pressure, we too could find ourselves moving to a rhythm we cannot hear, driven by a force we cannot name, unable to stop until something, or someone, decides we've danced enough. The streets of Strasbourg are quiet now. The cobblestones are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. But if you stand there long enough, in the heat of July, you might imagine the sound of feet pounding in unison, the gasps of breath, the strange, fevered music that no one played. And you might wonder, was it madness? Was it manipulation? Or was it something else entirely? Something that still waits, patient, for the right moment to make us dance again? The Great Fire of London. It began in the early hours of September 2nd, 1666, in a small bakery on Pudding Lane. A single spark in the darkness, and within days, the city would be reduced to smoldering ash. But this is not just the story of a fire. It is the story of fear, manipulation, and the way a disaster can be used to rewrite history. London at the time was a city of timber and pitch, its streets narrow, its houses leaning toward each other like conspirators. The summer had been long and dry, and the air itself seemed ready to burn. When the flames began, they moved with a speed that defied belief, devouring homes, shops, and churches, leaping the Thames as if it were nothing. People fled with whatever they could carry, their minds locked in the primal panic that comes when survival is the only thought left. Psychology tells us that in moments of crisis, the human brain narrows its focus. We stop thinking in terms of days or years and start thinking in seconds. But that narrowing also makes us vulnerable. When fear takes hold, we look for someone to blame. And in the chaos of the Great Fire, blame became as dangerous as the flames themselves. Almost immediately, rumors began to spread. Foreigners, Catholics, spies. The city was already a tinderbox of religious and political tension, and the fire became the perfect spark to ignite it. Accusations flew faster than the embers. Men were dragged from the streets, beaten, even killed, not because there was proof, but because the mind, desperate for order, will accept any explanation that feels certain. But here's where the intrigue deepens. The official investigation concluded that the fire was an accident. Yet there are gaps in the record, missing testimonies, contradictory accounts, and decisions that make little sense if the goal was truly to stop the flames. Why were fire breaks delayed until it was too late? Why were certain wealthy districts spared while poorer areas burned unchecked? And why did the rebuilding of London seem to benefit a select few who emerged from the ashes richer and more powerful than before? The psychology of disaster is not just about fear, it's about opportunity. When a city is in ruins, the rules can be rewritten. Old debts can vanish in the smoke. Property lines can shift. And those with influence can shape the new city to their advantage. In the aftermath of the Great Fire, entire neighborhoods were redesigned, ownership quietly transferred, and the skyline transformed into something far more controlled. Some historians whisper that the fire was not merely a tragedy, but a cleansing, a way to erase the chaotic, overcrowded heart of London and replace it with something more orderly, more profitable, and more easily policed. If that is true, then the cover-up was not in hiding the fire's cause. It was in shaping the story so that no one would question the outcome. From a psychological standpoint, the most chilling part is how quickly the public accepted the official version. The mind craves closure. When faced with an event too vast to comprehend, we will cling to the first explanation that feels complete, even if it leaves questions unanswered. And once that explanation is accepted, the truth, whatever it may be, becomes almost impossible to recover. The fire burned for 4 days. When it was over, more than 13,000 homes were gone, along with 87 churches and countless businesses. The city was unrecognizable. Yet the death toll, officially, was said to be remarkably low, so low that even at the time, people doubted it. Where were the missing? Were they buried in the rubble, their numbers quietly erased to soften the blow? Or had they been removed from the record for reasons no one dared to speak aloud? The mystery is not just in how the fire started, but in how it ended. The flames were finally stopped not by the city's efforts, but by a shift in the wind. Nature, not man, decided when London would be spared. And yet, in the retelling, the narrative became one of resilience, of human triumph over disaster. It's a comforting story, but comfort is not the same as truth. In the years that followed, the Great Fire became a symbol. It was used to justify stricter building codes, heavier surveillance, and a more centralized control over the city's layout. It was held up as proof that London could rise from the ashes stronger than before. But beneath that triumph lay the quiet reality that not everyone was allowed to rise with it. The poor who lost everything were often pushed out entirely, their land absorbed into the new design. Their voices, like the smoke, drifted away and disappeared. The psychology of the Great Fire is the psychology of every great disaster. In the moment, it is chaos, heat, noise, confusion. But in the aftermath, it becomes a canvas. Those with power decide which parts of the story to paint in vivid detail and which to leave blank. And over time, the blanks are forgotten, replaced by the version of events that serves the present, not the past. Perhaps that is why the Great Fire still fascinates us. Because it is not just about a city that burned. It is about the way we remember and the way memory can be shaped. It is about how fear can be redirected, how tragedy can be turned into opportunity, and how the truth can be buried not under rubble, but under narrative. The streets of modern London bear little resemblance to the city that burned in 1666. But if you walk them at night, when the air is still and the lights are low, you might imagine the glow of flames on the horizon, the sound of footsteps on cobblestones, the whispers of blame and suspicion carried on the wind. And you might wonder, not just how the fire began, but who truly benefited when it was over. Because in the end, the Great Fire of London was more than a disaster. It was a turning point. And like all turning points, its true story may be hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see it. The Chernobyl Disaster. April 26, 1986. In the quiet hours before dawn, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded, tearing open not just the building, but the illusion of control over the most dangerous force humanity had ever harnessed. The blast sent a column of radioactive material into the night sky, invisible, silent, and deadly. And yet, in the hours that followed, the truth would be buried under layers of denial, secrecy, and calculated deception. Psychology tells us that in moments of crisis, the human mind clings to normalcy. It resists the idea that the world has changed in an instant. In the control room, operators stared at their instruments, unable or unwilling to accept what they were seeing. The readings were impossible. The reactor couldn't have exploded, and so they acted as if it hadn't. But denial is contagious. Within hours, the plant's leadership was telling government officials that the situation was under control. The nearby city of Pripyat awoke to a normal Saturday morning. Children went to school. Couples strolled through the park. The air shimmered with invisible poison, but the people breathed it in without fear because no one had told them they should be afraid. This is the psychology of control. When those in power fear panic more than danger, they choose silence. And silence can kill. The mystery of Chernobyl is not in how the reactor exploded. That story is written in engineering reports and declassified transcripts. The mystery is in the decisions made afterward. Why were the residents of Pripyat left in place for 36 hours, even as radiation levels soared? Why were soldiers and firefighters sent into the heart of the disaster without protective gear, told only that they were fighting a routine fire? And why, in the days that followed, did the official narrative shift from accident to sabotage to nothing at all? The cover-up began almost immediately. Radiation monitors in Sweden detected the fallout before the Soviet public was even informed. When the news finally broke, it was framed as a minor incident, exaggerated by foreign enemies. The psychology here is as old as power itself. Control the story, and you control the perception of reality. If the people believe the danger is small, they will not question the decisions of those in charge. But the truth was not small. The explosion had released more radiation than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined. Entire regions were contaminated. And yet, the official death toll remained suspiciously low, 31, according to the state. A number so precise, so contained, that it felt more like a performance than a fact. From a psychological perspective, this is the power of numbers. A small number reassures. It makes the disaster seem finite, manageable. But the real toll, thousands of lives shortened by cancer, illness, and displacement, was hidden in the shadows, uncounted, unspoken. The intrigue deepens when you look at the political climate of the time. The Soviet Union was built on the image of technological superiority. Chernobyl was not just a reactor, it was a symbol. To admit its failure was to admit weakness. And weakness was unacceptable. So the disaster was reframed, not as a flaw in the system, but as the fault of individuals, operators blamed for reckless mistakes, their names etched into history as scapegoats. But even that narrative is incomplete. Declassified documents suggest that the reactor design itself was dangerously unstable, a flaw known to engineers long before the explosion. Warnings had been raised, reports filed, but the cost of redesign was deemed too high. And so, the flaw remained, hidden until it tore the roof off Reactor 4. This is where psychology and cover-up intertwine. When an institution's survival depends on its image, truth becomes negotiable. Facts are filtered, reshaped, or erased entirely. And over time, the official version becomes the only version most people will ever know. The evacuation of Pripyat was carried out with eerie calm. Buses rolled in, residents told to pack for 3 days. They left pets behind, locked their doors, believing they would return. They never did. The city still stands, frozen in time, a monument to the moment when trust was betrayed. And yet, even in the aftermath, the manipulation continued. The cleanup crews, known as liquidators, were sent into the exclusion zone in waves, often without full knowledge of the risks. Some were told they were heroes. Others were told nothing at all. The psychology here is brutal. When people believe their suffering has purpose, they endure more than they otherwise could. And so, the truth was rationed, given only in doses that served the state's needs. The mystery of Chernobyl is not just about what happened in 1986. It's about how the story has been told ever since. How the official narrative has shifted, softened, and, in some cases, hardened into myth. It's about the photographs that were never released, the medical records that vanished, the testimonies that were silenced. Even today, the exclusion zone is a place of contradictions. Nature has reclaimed the streets, wildlife thriving in the absence of humans. But beneath the beauty lies contamination that will outlast us all. It is a reminder that some truths cannot be buried, no matter how deep the cover-up. From a psychological standpoint, Chernobyl forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. When disaster strikes, the first casualty is often reality itself. The mind seeks certainty, and in the absence of facts, it will accept whatever story is offered, especially if that story comes from authority. And once that story takes root, it becomes harder to uproot than the disaster itself. The Chernobyl disaster was more than an explosion. It was a test of trust, a study in fear, and a masterclass in the manipulation of truth. It showed how quickly the human mind can be guided away from reality, and how easily a tragedy can be reshaped into a narrative that serves those in power. The reactor is silent now. The sarcophagus stands over it like a tomb. But the real containment is not in the concrete, it is in the story. And that story, like the radiation beneath it, will linger for generations, unseen, but never harmless. The sinking of the Titanic. April 15, 1912. A night so cold the sea itself seemed made of glass, reflecting the stars above like a silent witness. The unsinkable ship, the pride of modern engineering, lay broken beneath the waves. More than 1,500 lives lost in the darkness. But the true story of the Titanic is not just about an iceberg. It is about human psychology, hidden truths, and the way tragedy can be shaped into a narrative that serves those who survive it. From the moment the Titanic set sail, it was more than a ship, it was a statement. A floating palace, a symbol of wealth, progress, and the belief that humanity had conquered nature. That belief is dangerous. Psychologists call it the illusion of invulnerability, the conviction that disaster happens to others, never to us. It blinds us to risk, dulls our instincts, and makes us ignore warnings we should heed. The Titanic received multiple iceberg warnings that day. Some were dismissed. Some never reached the bridge. Why? Because the human mind, once committed to a vision, resists anything that threatens it. To acknowledge danger would have meant slowing down, arriving late, tarnishing the image of perfection. And so, the ship pressed on at near full speed into the icy Atlantic night. When the iceberg struck, the sound was not the deafening crash many imagine. It was a muted, almost gentle scrape. Passengers barely noticed. The psychology of that moment is chilling. When reality doesn't match our expectations of disaster, we often fail to act. People lingered in their cabins, dressed slowly, even returned to bed. The mind clings to normalcy, even as the water rises. But here's where the mystery deepens. The Titanic was built with watertight compartments, designed to keep her afloat even if several were breached. Yet the damage pattern was oddly precise, just enough to overwhelm the design, as if fate had chosen the exact combination to bring her down. Some have speculated about flaws in the steel, rushed construction, or even deliberate cost-cutting that weakened her hull. If true, these details were quietly buried in the aftermath, replaced with the simpler, cleaner story of an unavoidable accident. The cover-up began almost immediately. Two official inquiries, one in the United States, one in Britain, produced reports that placed the blame largely on human error and bad luck. But both stopped short of fully examining the role of corporate pressure, design compromises, and the decisions made by those in command. The shipping company, White Star Line, had powerful allies. And in the world of early 20th century industry, reputation was as valuable as steel. From a psychological perspective, the inquiries served another purpose: closure. The public needed a narrative they could accept, one that allowed them to grieve without questioning the entire system that had built the Titanic. So the story became one of heroism and tragedy, of gallant men giving up their seats, of a ship meeting her fate with dignity. It was a story that comforted, even as it concealed. Yet there are details that refuse to fade. Why were so few lifeboats carried, when the ship could have held more? Why were some launched half empty, even as hundreds waited on deck? Why did the Californian, a nearby ship, fail to respond in time, despite reports of distress rockets? Each question opens another crack in the official version, another shadow where truth might hide. The psychology of survival is brutal. In the lifeboats, class divisions persisted. First-class passengers often seated together, steerage passengers left behind. Even in the face of death, the social order held. And when the survivors reached land, their accounts were filtered through the lens of self-preservation. Memory is not a perfect record. It is a negotiation between what happened and what we can live with. Some survivors spoke of strange lights on the horizon that night, ships that appeared and vanished. Others claimed the iceberg warnings had been far more urgent than the officers admitted. And there are whispers, never proven, that the Titanic was not the Titanic at all, but her nearly identical sister ship, the Olympic, hastily disguised after a costly accident. If such a switch had occurred, the sinking would have erased a financial disaster under the guise of tragedy. It is a theory dismissed by many, but its persistence speaks to the human need to find patterns, to believe that great disasters must have great causes. In the end, the Titanic story is as much about the mind as it is about the sea. It is about how confidence can become arrogance, how warnings can be ignored when they threaten the image we want to project. It is about how, in the aftermath, truth can be shaped, not by what happened, but by who gets to tell the story. The wreck lay undiscovered for over 70 years, hidden 2 miles beneath the Atlantic. When it was finally found, it revealed details the official reports had never mentioned. Evidence of the ship breaking apart before it sank, debris scattered far and wide. The sea had preserved its own version of events, untouched by human editing. But even now, more than a century later, the full truth remains elusive. Perhaps that is why the Titanic endures in our imagination. It is not just a shipwreck, it is a mirror. It reflects our faith in progress, our blindness to danger, our ability to turn tragedy into legend. It reminds us that the line between confidence and catastrophe is thinner than we think. The night the Titanic went down, the band played on. Music drifted over the freezing water as the ship's lights flickered and died. It is a haunting image, one that captures the essence of the disaster. Not panic, not chaos, but a calm acceptance shaped by the belief that even in the face of death, appearances must be maintained. And maybe that is the final truth of the Titanic. That beneath the heroism and the heartbreak lies a quieter, more unsettling story of how we choose the version of events we can live with and let the rest sink into the dark where no one will ever find it. The Challenger Explosion, January 28, 1986. A clear winter morning in Florida, the kind of day that seemed made for history. 7 astronauts boarded the Space Shuttle Challenger, their mission broadcast live to millions. Among them was Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher chosen to inspire a generation. The countdown began, the engines roared, and the shuttle rose into the sky. 73 seconds later, it was gone, shattered in a plume of fire and smoke against the blue. The official cause would be traced to a failed O-ring seal in one of the solid rocket boosters. But the deeper story is not just about engineering. It's about the human mind, the weight of ambition, and the way truth can be shaped in the aftermath of disaster. Psychology tells us that when a goal is tied to national pride, risk becomes harder to see. NASA was under pressure, budget constraints, political scrutiny, and the desire to prove that space travel could be routine. The Challenger mission had already been delayed multiple times. Each delay was a blow to the image of reliability they were trying to project. In such an environment, the mind begins to filter information, prioritizing what supports the mission over what threatens it. Engineers had warned about the O-rings. They knew cold temperatures could make them brittle, that the morning's freezing air posed a danger. But warnings are only as powerful as the willingness to hear them. In the psychology of large organizations, dissent often gets softened, reframed, or buried entirely. No one wants to be the voice that stops the launch, especially when the world is watching. The decision to proceed was not made in a single moment of recklessness. It was the result of what psychologists call normalization of deviance, the gradual acceptance of risk because nothing bad has happened yet. Previous flights had shown signs of O-ring erosion, but the shuttles had returned safely. Each time, the absence of disaster was taken as proof that the risk was manageable. Until it wasn't. The explosion was broadcast live, and for a moment, no one seemed to understand what they were seeing. The human brain resists instant comprehension of catastrophe. Some thought the shuttle had simply separated into stages. Others waited for the crew to emerge. It took seconds for the truth to sink in, and those seconds felt like an eternity. Then came the cover-up, not in the sense of hiding the fact that the shuttle was gone, but in controlling the narrative of why. The first statements were vague, emphasizing the bravery of the crew and the unpredictability of spaceflight. The technical details were slow to emerge, and when they did, they were wrapped in language that softened the reality. A hardware failure, a tragic accident, as if the chain of decisions leading to that morning were inevitable. But the Rogers Commission, tasked with investigating the disaster, uncovered a more troubling truth. The O-ring flaw was known. The cold weather risk was known. And the decision to launch had been made despite those warnings. The psychology here is as old as human ambition. When the stakes are high enough, we convince ourselves that the odds are in our favor, even when the evidence says otherwise. There is another layer of intrigue, one that lingers in the gaps between official accounts. Some witnesses claimed that the crew cabin remained intact after the explosion, that it continued to arc through the air before hitting the ocean. If true, it means the astronauts may have been alive for the 2.5 minutes it took to fall. The thought is almost unbearable, and perhaps that is why it has never been fully addressed in public statements. Some truths are too heavy to carry into the open. The Challenger disaster also reveals the psychology of collective grief. In the days that followed, the nation mourned not just the loss of 7 lives, but the shattering of an illusion that space travel had become safe, predictable, almost ordinary. The image of the shuttle's plumes splitting into 2 curling trails became etched into memory, a symbol of both human courage and human fallibility. Yet, even in grief, the machinery of image control kept turning. NASA's public communications focused on honoring the crew's legacy, on the idea that exploration must continue. It was a message designed to inspire, but also to protect the institution from the full weight of blame. The psychology of resilience can be genuine, but it can also be used as a shield. In the years since, the Challenger has been remembered as a lesson in listening to warnings, in respecting the limits of technology. But the deeper lesson is about the limits of human perception. We are wired to believe in progress, to push forward, to assume that if we've succeeded before, we will succeed again. That belief drives innovation, but it can also blind us to the cracks forming beneath our feet. The wreckage of Challenger was recovered from the ocean floor, much of it stored away, unseen by the public. The official reports are available, but the raw images, the unfiltered details, remain largely hidden. Perhaps that is intentional. Perhaps it is easier to remember the crew smiling on the launch pad than to confront the full reality of what happened in the sky. The Challenger explosion was more than a mechanical failure. It was a collision between ambition and reality, between the desire to inspire and the need to protect. It was a moment when the psychology of risk, the weight of expectation, and the quiet silencing of dissent converged into tragedy. The launch that morning was meant to be a triumph, a symbol of possibility. Instead, it became a reminder that even the most advanced machines are vulnerable to the smallest flaws, and that the human mind, in its drive to achieve, can sometimes be the most dangerous flaw of all. And maybe that is why the Challenger still haunts us. Because it forces us to ask not just how it happened, but how often we make the same bargain, choosing the story we want to tell over the truth we need to face. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. It began quietly, almost invisibly, just another illness in a world already drowning in the chaos of war. Soldiers in cramped barracks coughed and fevered, their symptoms dismissed as nothing unusual. But within months, the sickness had swept across continents, killing more people than the First World War itself. And yet, for decades, the full truth of what happened remained buried beneath layers of silence, misdirection, and selective memory. The psychology of the Spanish flu begins with its timing. The world was still at war, and governments feared that acknowledging the scale of the outbreak would weaken morale. In the United States, Britain, France, and Germany, newspapers were censored. Reports were softened, delayed, or erased entirely. Only neutral Spain reported freely on the epidemic, earning it the name Spanish flu, despite the fact that it did not originate there. This was the first cover-up, not of the disease itself, but of its reach. If the public didn't know how bad it was, they wouldn't panic, or so the thinking went. But fear doesn't need facts to grow. Psychologists know that uncertainty is more corrosive than bad news. When people sense danger but are denied information, the mind fills the gaps with its own stories. Rumors spread faster than the virus, whispers of poisoned wells, secret weapons, or divine punishment. And in the absence of truth, those whispers became reality for millions. The mystery of the Spanish flu lies partly in its brutality. Unlike most influenza strains, it struck hardest at the young and healthy. Men and women in their 20s and 30s, people in the prime of life, were suddenly collapsing, their skin turning blue from lack of oxygen. Some died within hours of their first symptoms. Doctors were baffled. Theories ranged from an unusually aggressive virus to an overreaction of the immune system itself, a deadly storm unleashed by the body's own defenses. Even now, over a century later, the exact origins of the strain remain uncertain. But there is another mystery, one that has less to do with biology and more to do with human behavior. Why did so many leaders downplay the danger, even as the death toll climbed into the millions? Part of the answer lies in wartime propaganda. The war effort demanded unity, sacrifice, and the appearance of control. Admitting that a disease was killing soldiers faster than bullets would have shattered that illusion. And so, the truth was rationed, given only in fragments, always framed to protect the image of strength. The cover-up had consequences. Public gatherings continued. Parades were held. In Philadelphia, a massive war bonds parade went ahead despite warnings from doctors. Within days, the city's hospitals were overflowing, and bodies were stacked in makeshift morgues. The psychology here is chilling. When authority tells us it's safe, we are more likely to ignore our own instincts. We outsource our judgment to those we believe know better, sometimes with fatal results. The Spanish flu also revealed the human mind's need for normalcy. Even as the sick filled the streets, people clung to routines. Shops stayed open. Churches held services. Masks were worn in some places, mocked in others. The tension between self-preservation and the desire for life to go on created a strange dual reality, one where death was everywhere, yet daily life persisted as if nothing had changed. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the flu began to fade. By the summer of 1919, the worst was over. The war had ended, the world was rebuilding, and the pandemic slipped quietly into the background. There were no grand memorials, no national days of mourning. It was as if the world had agreed to forget. Psychologists call this collective amnesia, a defense mechanism that allows societies to move forward by burying the trauma they cannot process. But forgetting is not the same as healing. The silence around the Spanish flu meant that its lessons were never fully learned. Medical systems were not overhauled. Pandemic preparedness was not prioritized. And when future outbreaks came, the same mistakes, denial, delay, and the politicization of truth would be repeated. There are still unanswered questions. Some researchers believe the virus may have originated in a military camp in Kansas, carried overseas by American troops. Others point to China, France, or even the Arctic as possible sources. The lack of definitive answers is partly due to the destruction or deliberate omission of records. In some cases, entire archives from the period are missing. Whether this was the result of chaos, neglect, or intentional erasure remains unclear. The intrigue deepens when you consider the economic and political shifts that followed. The pandemic reshaped labor markets, altered migration patterns, and influenced the outcome of peace negotiations. Yet these effects are rarely discussed in history books. It is as if the flu was a ghost, present everywhere, yet invisible in the official story. From a psychological standpoint, the Spanish flu is a study in how humans respond to invisible threats. We fear what we cannot see, but we also resist changing our lives for something we cannot touch. We crave certainty, and when certainty is denied, we cling to whatever narrative feels safest. In 1918, that narrative was one of endurance, of carrying on no matter the cost. It was a story that inspired resilience, but also allowed the truth to be buried. The Spanish flu killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide. It touched every continent, every class, every culture. And yet, for decades, it was a footnote in history. Perhaps because it offered no clear villain, no battlefield heroics, no easy moral. It was a reminder that nature, not war, can be the greatest threat to human life. And that is a truth many would rather not face. Today, the pandemic exists in fragments, faded photographs of massed crowds, diary entries from nurses, brief mentions in old newspapers. The rest is silence. And in that silence lies the greatest cover-up of all, not a conspiracy of men, but the quiet agreement of a world that chose to forget. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 was more than a medical crisis. It was a test of trust, a lesson in the dangers of secrecy, and a mirror held up to the human mind. It showed how fear can be shaped, how truth can be managed, and how even the deadliest events can vanish from memory when remembering becomes too heavy to bear. And maybe that is the final mystery. Not where the flu began, or why it struck as it did, but why, after so much loss, the world turned the page so quickly and never looked back. The Jonestown Massacre, November 18, 1978. Deep in the remote jungles of Guyana, more than 900 people died in a single day. Men, women, and children, most by drinking a poison concoction handed to them by those they trusted most. It remains one of the largest mass deaths in modern history outside of war, and yet the full truth of what happened in Jonestown is still tangled in shadows. On the surface, the story is about a man named Jim Jones, the charismatic leader of the People's Temple. He preached equality, racial integration, and a utopian vision of a better world. But psychology tells us that charisma is a double-edged sword. It can inspire hope, but it can also bypass critical thinking. When someone speaks with absolute certainty, the human mind is wired to find comfort in their confidence, especially in times of fear or uncertainty. And Jones knew exactly how to use that. By the mid-1970s, Jones had moved his followers from the United States to Guyana, promising them a paradise free from the corruption of the outside world. In reality, Jonestown was isolated, controlled, and built on a foundation of obedience. The people there were cut off from their families, their passports confiscated, their letters censored. In such an environment, the mind begins to adapt to the rules of the group, even when those rules defy personal instincts. Psychologists call this bounded reality, when the world you live in becomes so small that the impossible starts to feel normal. But the mystery of Jonestown is not just about how Jones gained control, it's about how it all ended. The official story says that after U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan arrived to investigate reports of abuse, tensions escalated. Ryan and several others were killed at a nearby airstrip, and hours later, Jones ordered his followers to commit revolutionary suicide. They drank a mixture of cyanide, sedatives, and fruit punch. Those who refused were forced. Children were dosed first. The recordings from that day are chilling, Jones' voice calm, almost soothing, as he tells them this is the only way to escape what's coming. But here's where the intrigue deepens. Some survivors and researchers have questioned whether it was truly suicide at all. Autopsy reports suggested that many victims had needle marks, indicating they may have been injected. Others were found with gunshot wounds. If that's true, then Jonestown was not a mass suicide, it was a mass murder. And if it was murder, then the question becomes, why was the world so quick to accept the simpler story? The cover-up, if there was one, may have begun before the bodies were even cold. The U.S. government's response was swift but strangely limited. The site was cleared, evidence removed, and the narrative of drinking the Kool-Aid became the shorthand explanation. It was a phrase that reduced a complex, horrifying event into a dark joke, one that shifted focus away from the deeper questions about manipulation, coercion, and the systems that allowed Jones to operate unchecked. From a psychological perspective, the cult label served a purpose. It created distance. It allowed the public to believe that the victims were nothing like them, that they were weak, gullible, somehow complicit in their own deaths. This is a defense mechanism. If we believe we could never be manipulated, we feel safe. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. Under the right conditions, charisma, isolation, fear, almost anyone can be drawn into a system that overrides their own survival instincts. The mystery also extends to Jones himself. Was he always a manipulator, or did he believe in his own vision until paranoia consumed him? In his final months, he was reportedly addicted to drugs, increasingly erratic, convinced that enemies were closing in. He spoke often of conspiracies, of CIA plots, of an impending apocalypse. Whether those threats were real or imagined, they became real to him, and when a leader's reality collapses, so does the reality of everyone who depends on them. There are still unanswered questions about Jonestown's funding, its political connections, and the extent of outside knowledge before the massacre. Some documents remain classified. Some witnesses have never spoken publicly. And in the absence of answers, speculation thrives. Was Jonestown simply the tragic end of a dangerous cult, or was it part of something larger? An experiment in control, a test of how far obedience can be pushed? The psychology of Jonestown is not just about the followers, it's about us. It forces us to confront how easily truth can be shaped, how quickly a narrative can be cemented, and how the human mind will cling to that narrative even when cracks begin to show. It's about the danger of certainty, the seduction of belonging, and the terrifying power of a leader who convinces people that death is preferable to doubt. In the days after the massacre, the images from Jonestown shocked the world. Hundreds of bodies lying face down in the grass, eerily still. But over time, the shock faded, replaced by a simplified version of events. The complexity, the contradictions, the unanswered questions, those were left behind in the jungle. And maybe that was the final act of control, not by Jones, but by the way history chose to remember him. The Jonestown Massacre was more than a tragedy. It was a study in the mechanics of influence, the fragility of perception, and the ease with which reality can be rewritten. It showed that the line between devotion and destruction is thinner than we want to believe, and that once crossed, it is almost impossible to return. Today, Jonestown is overgrown, reclaimed by the jungle. The buildings are gone, the voices silenced. But the psychology that made it possible, the hunger for certainty, the comfort of belonging, the surrender of doubt, still exists. It exists in politics, in movements, in the quiet corners of human relationships. And that is why Jonestown is not just history. It is a warning. Because the most dangerous part of the Jonestown story is not that it happened once. It's that it could happen again. The Hindenburg Disaster. May 6, 1937. A massive airship, longer than 3 football fields, drifts toward its mooring mast in Lakehurst, New Jersey. It is the pride of German engineering, a floating palace in the sky, carrying passengers and luxury across the Atlantic. On the ground, cameras roll, reporters wait, and a crowd gathers to witness the future of air travel. Then, without warning, the sky ignites. In less than a minute, the Hindenburg is reduced to a burning skeleton, collapsing to the earth in a storm of fire and smoke. The official explanation would come quickly. Hydrogen, the flammable gas that kept the airship aloft, had ignited. But the deeper story is not just about chemistry. It's about human psychology, unanswered questions, and the way a disaster can be shaped into a narrative that hides as much as it reveals. The Hindenburg was more than a machine. It was a symbol. For Germany, it was a statement of technological dominance, a floating ambassador of national pride during a time when the world was watching. For passengers, it was proof that the future had arrived, fast, elegant, and safe. And that belief in safety is where the psychology begins. When people are told something is the pinnacle of progress, they stop looking for flaws. They trust the image, not the reality. The airship's final flight began without incident. It crossed the Atlantic smoothly, its passengers dining in comfort, gazing out at the ocean far below. But as it approached Lakehurst, weather delays forced it to circle. The crew adjusted ballast, vented gas, and prepared for landing. Then, moments before the mooring lines were secured, witnesses saw a flash, small at first, then consuming the entire ship in seconds. The mystery lies in that first spark. The official investigation concluded that a static discharge ignited leaking hydrogen. But even at the time, there were doubts. Some pointed to sabotage, a deliberate act meant to send a political message. Others suggested a mechanical failure, a ruptured gas cell, or even a design flaw that had been quietly ignored. The truth is, no single theory has ever been proven beyond doubt. From a psychological perspective, the speed of the disaster is key. The human brain struggles to process events that unfold in seconds. Survivors described confusion more than fear. One moment they were standing on the deck, the next they were surrounded by fire. In such moments, instinct takes over. Some jumped from the burning frame. Others froze, unable to move until it was too late. It is a reminder that in crisis, survival is as much about mental readiness as physical escape. But the intrigue doesn't end with the cause. It deepens in the aftermath. The Hindenburg was filled with hydrogen because the United States, which controlled the world's supply of helium, refused to sell it to Germany. Helium was safer, non-flammable, but politically out of reach. This fact was downplayed in official reports, perhaps to avoid drawing attention to the political tensions that had forced the use of a dangerous alternative. Then there is the question of the covering, the silver skin of the airship. Some researchers have argued that it was coated with a mixture of chemicals that, under the right conditions, could ignite like rocket fuel. If true, the Hindenburg was not just vulnerable because of hydrogen, it was a flying torch waiting for a match. Yet this theory was never fully embraced by the authorities, perhaps because it would have shifted blame from an unavoidable accident to a preventable design choice. The cover-up, if it can be called that, was subtle. The disaster was framed as a tragic but isolated event, not the result of systemic flaws in airship design. The narrative focused on the bravery of the crew, the heroism of rescuers, and the resilience of survivors. It was a story that honored the dead while protecting the reputations of those who had built and operated the ship. And in doing so, it allowed the deeper questions to fade from public view. Psychologically, the Hindenburg disaster became a turning point, not just for aviation, but for public trust in technology. The image of the burning airship, captured on film and broadcast with the now famous words of a horrified reporter, seared itself into the collective memory. It was proof that even the most advanced creations could fail spectacularly. And once that trust was broken, the era of passenger airships was over almost overnight. Yet the mystery lingers. Was it truly an accident, the inevitable result of hydrogen's volatility? Or was it something more deliberate, an act of sabotage, a political statement, a warning? The lack of definitive evidence leaves space for speculation, and speculation thrives where certainty is absent. The psychology of disaster tells us that people crave closure. We want a cause, a culprit, a neat ending. But sometimes, the truth is messy, layered, and inconvenient. In the case of the Hindenburg, the official story provided enough answers to satisfy the public, but not enough to silence doubt. And perhaps that was intentional. A mystery unresolved is easier to live with than a truth that implicates powerful interests. Today, the Hindenburg exists in history as both a cautionary tale and a symbol of hubris. Its wreckage was cleared, its survivors scattered, and its story condensed into a few haunting images. But behind those images lies a web of unanswered questions about design, about politics, about the choices made in the name of progress. The disaster lasted only 34 seconds from the first flame to the final collapse. But in that half minute, it destroyed not just a ship, but an entire vision of the future. And in the silence that followed, the narrative was shaped, not by those who died, but by those who decided how the world would remember them. The Hindenburg disaster was more than a fire in the sky. It was a study in the fragility of trust, the power of image, and the way truth can be managed in the wake of tragedy. It showed that progress is never immune to failure, and that sometimes the most enduring part of a disaster is not the wreckage left behind, but the questions that will never be fully answered. The Great Molasses Flood in Boston, January 15, 1919. A winter morning in the North End, the air sharp with cold, the streets alive with the sounds of a working city. Then, without warning, a deep, resonant crack. A steel tank, towering over the neighborhood, bursts open. 2 million gallons of thick, dark molasses surge into the streets, a wave 25 feet high moving at 35 miles per hour. Buildings are ripped from their foundations. Horses, wagons, and people are swept away in a tide so heavy it crushes as it flows. By the time it stops, 21 are dead, and the streets are coated in a sticky, suffocating ruin. The official story is simple: the tank failed. But the deeper truth is tangled in psychology, mystery, and the quiet art of the cover-up. The tank belonged to the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, a giant in the business of turning molasses into industrial alcohol, an ingredient in munitions and other wartime products. The First World War had just ended, but the demand for alcohol was still high. The tank had been built quickly, without proper testing, and from the moment it was filled, locals reported leaks. Children would scoop molasses from the seams with tin cups. The company's response was not to fix the problem, but to paint the tank brown so the leaks would be harder to see. Here is where psychology enters the story. When a corporation, or any authority, projects confidence, the human mind is inclined to believe it. Residents complained, but the company dismissed them. And when experts tell you something is safe, you are more likely to doubt your own instincts than their assurances. This is the dangerous power of perceived authority. It can make people ignore the evidence in front of their eyes. The day of the disaster, the tank was filled to near capacity. The temperature had risen sharply, causing the molasses to ferment and build pressure. Inside, the steel walls strained. Outside, no one knew that the tank was seconds from tearing itself apart. When it did, the destruction was surreal. Molasses is heavier than water, and in that moment, it moved like a living thing, rolling, twisting, swallowing everything in its path. Survivors spoke of being trapped, unable to breathe, the syrup pulling them under like quicksand. The mind, in panic, fights for air, but in molasses, every movement only drags you deeper. The mystery begins in the aftermath. The company immediately blamed sabotage. It was the height of the Red Scare. Fear of anarchists, radicals, and foreign agitators was everywhere. Blaming an enemy was easier than admitting negligence. And in the psychology of crisis, people often accept the explanation that fits their fears, even if it doesn't fit the facts. But the facts were damning. The steel used for the tank was too thin. It had not been tested for brittleness in cold weather. The rivets were weak. Internal records showed that the company had known about the leaks for years. Yet for months after the disaster, the sabotage theory persisted, repeated in newspapers and whispered in political circles. It was a narrative designed to protect the company's image, and it worked, at least for a while. The cover-up was not absolute, but it was strategic. The company hired lawyers who argued that the disaster was unforeseeable, that no one could have predicted such a failure. They leaned on the chaos of the time, labor strikes, political unrest, the lingering shadow of war, to frame the flood as an act of malice rather than neglect. And in doing so, they shifted the conversation away from engineering flaws and corporate responsibility. From a psychological standpoint, this tactic exploited a basic human bias, the need for a villain. A faceless mechanical failure is unsatisfying. A saboteur, a hidden hand, gives the mind something to fight against. It turns tragedy into a story, and stories are easier to accept than the cold, impersonal truth that greed and carelessness can kill. The legal battle lasted years. Witnesses testified about the leaks, the groaning of the tank, the way the company ignored warnings. Experts dismantled the sabotage theory piece by piece. Eventually, the court ruled against the company, ordering them to pay damages. But by then, the public's attention had shifted. The disaster faded into a strange footnote in history, remembered more for its oddity than for the lives it destroyed. And that, perhaps, is the final layer of the cover-up, not the hiding of facts, but the reframing of memory. The Great Molasses Flood became a curiosity, a bizarre anecdote, rather than a cautionary tale about corporate negligence. The sticky streets, the surreal image of a city drowning in syrup, overshadowed the systemic failures that made it possible. The psychology of this reframing is subtle. When a tragedy is absurd, it is easier to laugh than to confront its implications. Humor becomes a shield, protecting us from the discomfort of knowing that the same forces, greed, denial, the silencing of warnings, still operate today. And so, the flood lives on as a strange story, its lessons diluted like sugar in water. But the mystery remains. Why was the tank allowed to operate in such a state for so long? Why were the warnings ignored? And why, even after the truth was known, did the sabotage theory linger in the public mind? The answers lie in the intersection of power and perception. When those in control shape the narrative, the truth becomes just one version of events, and not always the one that survives. Today, the site of the flood is unremarkable, the streets clean, the air free of the sweet, cloying smell that once hung over the neighborhood. But if you stand there and imagine the wave, dark, heavy, unstoppable, you might feel the weight of more than just molasses. You might feel the weight of a story carefully managed, of a truth that had to fight to be heard. The Great Molasses Flood was more than a freak accident. It was a study in how authority can override instinct, how fear can be redirected, and how history can be sweetened until it no longer tastes like the truth. And perhaps that is the stickiest part of all, not the molasses that coated Boston streets, but the way the real story still clings, hidden beneath the version we were told. The Chicago Fire of 1871. October 8th, a Sunday night, when the city was quieting down, its streets lit by flickering gas lamps and the glow of hearth fires. In the southwest corner of Chicago, a small blaze began, its exact spark still debated to this day. Within hours, that spark became an inferno, devouring block after block, leaping rivers, and turning the city into a furnace. By the time it burned itself out 2 days later, more than 17,000 buildings were gone, 100,000 people were homeless, and the heart of Chicago was reduced to ash. The official story has been told so many times it feels like folklore: a cow, a lantern, and a careless moment in the O'Leary family's barn. But the deeper you look, the more that story begins to unravel. Because the truth of the Great Chicago Fire is not just about flames. It's about human psychology, unanswered questions, and the way a city can rewrite its own history. Chicago in 1871 was a city built for disaster. Most of its buildings were made of wood, even the sidewalks and streets. A long, dry summer had turned the city into a tinderbox. Strong winds off Lake Michigan could carry embers for blocks. And yet, despite these conditions, the city's leadership projected confidence. Psychologists call this the normalcy bias, the belief that because something hasn't happened yet, it won't happen at all. Warnings were ignored. Precautions were minimal. And when the fire began, the city was woefully unprepared. The mystery begins with the fire's origin. The O'Leary cow story was convenient, simple, memorable, and easy to blame on a single family. But eyewitness accounts conflict. Some claim they saw men in the barn before the fire started. Others spoke of embers already falling from the sky, suggesting another fire nearby. And then there's the fact that the O'Learys themselves were never formally charged, and Mrs. O'Leary denied the story until her death. If the cow didn't kick over the lantern, who or what did? The cover-up, if there was one, may have been less about hiding the cause and more about controlling the narrative. Chicago was a city on the rise, a hub of commerce and industry. A fire caused by negligence in city planning, poor firefighting infrastructure, or political corruption would have been a devastating blow to its reputation. Blaming a single family, immigrants, poor, and without influence, shifted attention away from systemic failures. It gave the public a villain, and it allowed the city's leaders to rebuild without admitting their own role in the disaster. From a psychological perspective, this tactic worked because people crave closure. A disaster without a clear cause is unsettling. It leaves the mind searching for answers, replaying possibilities. By offering a simple explanation, even a false one, the city gave its citizens a way to move forward. And once a story takes root, it becomes harder to dislodge than the truth itself. But the intrigue doesn't end there. Some historians have suggested that the fire may have been one of several that night, part of a strange pattern stretching across the Midwest. Fires broke out in Wisconsin and Michigan on the same evening, including the Peshtigo Fire, which killed more people than the Chicago blaze but received far less attention. Theories range from meteor showers igniting dry land to coordinated acts of arson. None have been proven, but the coincidence is hard to ignore. The fire spread was fueled not just by wind and wood, but by human error. The city's watchmen misjudged the fire's location, sending firefighters to the wrong place. By the time they realized their mistake, the blaze was already out of control. In moments like this, the psychology of urgency takes over. Decisions are made quickly, often without full information, and mistakes compound. Once the fire reached the city's business district, the heat was so intense that brick buildings crumbled and metal melted in the streets. When the flames finally died, the scale of destruction was almost unimaginable. Entire neighborhoods were gone. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of charred wood. And yet, almost immediately, the city began to reframe the disaster, not as a failure, but as an opportunity. The narrative shifted from tragedy to triumph, from loss to rebirth. Chicago would rise from the ashes, stronger and more modern than before. This reframing was not accidental. It was a deliberate act of psychological and political strategy. Investors needed confidence to rebuild. Residents needed hope to stay. And so, the fire became part of Chicago's identity, not a shameful scar, but a badge of resilience. The O'Leary cow story persisted, not because it was true, but because it was useful. The cover-up, then, was not about hiding the fire. It was about shaping its meaning. By focusing on a single, almost comical cause, the city avoided deeper questions about its infrastructure, its leadership, and its priorities. It turned a systemic failure into a human interest story, one that could be told and retold without threatening the city's future. Even today, the truth of the Great Chicago Fire remains elusive. The official cause is still listed as unknown. The O'Leary family was eventually cleared of wrongdoing, but the myth endures. And perhaps that's the most telling part of the story, that the version we remember is not the one that happened, but the one that served the city best. From a psychological standpoint, the fire is a case study in how humans process catastrophe. We seek patterns, assign blame, and rewrite events to fit the narrative we need. We prefer a story with a beginning, middle, and end, even if the real story has none. And when those in power control the telling, the line between history and myth becomes almost impossible to see. The Chicago fire of 1871 was more than a blaze. It was a moment when fear, rumor, and ambition collided. It was a test of how far a city would go to protect its image, and how willing its people were to accept a story that made them feel safe. And in the end, it left behind not just ashes, but a reminder that sometimes the most enduring part of a disaster is not the destruction itself, but the version of the truth that survives it. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s, a decade when the very earth seemed to turn against the people who lived on it. Across the Great Plains, Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and beyond, the sky darkened with storms of dust so thick they blotted out the sun. The wind carried the soil itself, stripped from the land by years of drought and relentless farming, and hurled it across towns, farms, and cities. It was not just a natural disaster. It was a psychological siege, a mystery of survival, and a story shaped by silence and selective truth. The Great Plains had been sold to settlers as a paradise of endless opportunity. Government pamphlets promised fertile soil and boundless harvests. Railroads and land speculators painted a picture of prosperity, urging farmers to plow every inch of land. And they did, tearing up the native grasses that had anchored the soil for centuries. When the rain stopped in the early 1930s, the land had nothing to hold it together. The wind did the rest. Psychology plays a central role in this story. When people invest their lives, their savings, and their identities into a way of living, they resist the idea that it could all be wrong. Even as the first dust storms rolled in, many farmers believed the drought would break, that next season would be better. This is the sunk cost trap. The more you've given to something, the harder it is to walk away, even when the evidence says you should. The storms themselves were apocalyptic. Walls of dust hundreds of feet high moved like living creatures, swallowing everything in their path. Day turned to night in minutes. People stuffed wet rags under doors, covered their faces with damp cloths, and still the dust found its way in, coating food, bedding, and lungs. Children developed dust pneumonia. Livestock suffocated in the fields. The mind, under such constant assault, begins to fray. Depression, anxiety, and a sense of hopelessness spread as quickly as the storms themselves. The mystery lies in how the disaster was framed at the time. The Dust Bowl was often described as an unavoidable act of nature, a cruel twist of fate. But the truth was more complicated. The environmental collapse was the result of human choices, overfarming, poor soil management, and the destruction of native ecosystems. Acknowledging that meant admitting that the very policies and economic incentives that had driven settlement were flawed. And so, the narrative shifted. Nature was blamed. The role of human error was downplayed. The cover-up was subtle but effective. Government agencies and local leaders avoided language that suggested mismanagement. Instead, they focused on relief efforts, on the resilience of the people, on the promise of recovery. Photographs of stoic farmers and their families were circulated to inspire sympathy, but rarely did those images come with the full story of how the land had been pushed past its limits. It was easier to rally the nation around the idea of helping victims of a natural disaster than to confront the uncomfortable truth that the disaster had been, in part, man-made. From a psychological standpoint, this reframing served another purpose. It preserved hope. If the Dust Bowl was purely nature's doing, then nature could also undo it. Rain would return, crops would grow, and life would go back to normal. If it was human error, the solution would require not just waiting, but changing, abandoning old ways, admitting fault, and rebuilding from the ground up. That was a harder truth to face. The storms reached their peak on April 14, 1935, Black Sunday. A massive dust storm swept across the plains, turning midday into midnight. People who had endured years of hardship finally broke. Some packed what little they had and left for California, joining the great migration of Okies and Arkies in search of work. Others stayed, clinging to the hope that the land would heal. The migration itself became another layer of the story, met with sympathy in some places, hostility in others. Migrants were often seen as outsiders, blamed for taking jobs, and treated as second-class citizens. The intrigue deepens when you consider how the Dust Bowl intersected with the politics of the time. The Great Depression was already crippling the economy. The government's response to the Dust Bowl, through programs like the Soil Conservation Service, was both a relief effort and a political experiment in reshaping agriculture. Techniques like contour plowing, crop rotation, and replanting native grasses were introduced, but these changes also meant greater federal oversight of farming. For some, that was salvation. For others, it was intrusion. Even after the rains returned and the storms subsided, the Dust Bowl left scars on the land, on the people, and on the national psyche. Many survivors never spoke of it in detail, as if putting it into words would make the memories too real. Children who grew up in the storms carried the habits of scarcity and caution for the rest of their lives. And the land, though it recovered in places, never fully returned to what it had been before the plows came. The Dust Bowl of the 1930s was more than a weather event. It was a collision of human ambition and environmental limits, of hope and denial, of truth and the stories we tell to protect ourselves. It showed how easily a disaster can be reframed to fit the needs of those in power, and how the human mind will cling to the version of events that offers the most comfort. Today, the images of blackened skies and dust-choked towns are iconic. But behind them lies a deeper truth, that the greatest storms are not always born in the clouds. Sometimes, they are born in the choices we make, the warnings we ignore, and the stories we choose to believe.